Não venha com seus ataques, porque eu não posso ser quebrado. No máximo reprogramado.
Welcome to the December 2017 meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. The purpose of the Federal Communications Commission open meeting is for the Commission to consider the matters that have been duly posted in accordance with the Government in the Sunshine Act. As provided in the Commission's rules, members of the public are invited to observe, which includes attending, listening, and taking notes, but does not include participating in the meeting or addressing the Commission. Actions that purposely interfere or attempt to interfere with the commencement or conduct of the meeting or inhibit the audience's ability to observe or listen to the meeting, including attempts by audience members to address the Commission while the meeting is in progress, are not permitted. Any person engaging in such behavior will be asked to leave the building. Anyone who refuses to leave voluntarily will be escorted from the building. Additionally, documents presented to the chairman, commissioners, or staff during the meeting will not become part of the official record of any commission proceeding, nor will they require further action by the commission. If you wish to comment on an ongoing proceeding before the Commission, please visit our website for more information. A report and order that would amend the Commission's rules to add a dedicated event code to facilitate the delivery of blue alerts over the emergency alert system and wireless emergency alert system. Second, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking in order to strengthen the rural health care program and improve access to telehealth in rural America. Third, you will consider a public notice seeking input on a draft program comment addressing the historic preservation review requirements for co-locating wireless communications facilities on Twilight Towers. Fourth, you will consider a declaratory ruling, report, and order that will restore Internet freedom by returning broadband Internet access service to its prior classification as an information service and reinstate the private mobile service classification of mobile broadband Internet access service. The item also will eliminate the Commission's vague and expansive Internet conduct standard, along with the Bright Line rules. Additionally, it will modify the transparency rule to promote additional transparency while eliminating burdensome and unnecessary requirements. Fifth, you will consider a report in order to harmonize the Commission's rules by eliminating the commercial mobile radio service presumption to be consistent with our flexible use approach to licensing. Sixth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on ways to modernize certain notice provisions in Part 76 of the FCC's rules governing multi-channel video and cable television service. Seventh, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on whether to modify, retain, or eliminate the 39% national audience reach cap and or the UHF discount used by broadcast television station groups to calculate compliance with the cap. This is your agenda for today. The first item today will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and is entitled Amendment of Part 11 of the Commission's Rules Regarding Emergency Alert System. Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Folks, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Happy Thursday and happy holidays. The Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is pleased to present a report and order that would add a new alert option called a Blue Alert to the nation's emergency alert systems. Blue alerts can be used by state and local authorities to notify the public of threats to law enforcement and to help apprehend dangerous suspects. Specifically, the order would add a new 3-character event code BLU, Blue, to the Commission's Emergency Alert System rules. The Blue code will allow an immediately recognizable blue alert to reach the public through television, radio, and wireless phones. As I've mentioned previously, I am the granddaughter of a former detective in the Philadelphia Police Department. I appreciate the dangers that law enforcement officers face each day and the importance of protecting those who protect us. Today's order would support the Rafael Ramos and Wenjian Liu National Blue Alert Act of 2015, which was named for these two fallen New York City Police Department officers. Before we present the item, I would like to welcome the family and colleagues of the late detectives Ramos and Liu, who have traveled to be with us today. First, we will hear testimony from two family members of the late Detective Liu who are seated here, his father, Wang Tang Liu, and then Detective Liu's wife, Pa Shaw Chen, who will provide the family sentiments in English. Also seated with us is NYPD Sergeant Johnny Yin, who will serve as interpreter as needed. Next, we will hear testimony from Maritza Ramos, the wife of the late Detective Ramos. Also joining us at the table is William Bill Johnson, Executive Director of the National Association of Police or of the Department of Justice's Blue Alert Advisory Group. I will now turn it over to Detective Liu's father.
Đại ca hảo，你需唔需㗎？
你讀完先，你讀完你
哦
你讀完佢
大家好啊！我今晚好榮幸，你哋有請我嚟參觀屯谷藍色嘅二間菠蘿啦。今晚呢，我添置了月亮一鐵眼，那目上有文件嘅全國藍色預警法案。這啲法案呢，係保護全美執法人員生命嘅法律。我係劉文健嘅父母。我相信啦，嗰個法案啦，參與啦，有幫助於更好保護執法人嘅安全。3年前嘅12月，我們嘅兒子劉文健和其拍檔嘅阿牧師執行公務時殉職。而家今晚咧，參與嗰個法院以下文嘅名度嚟問問，這是為劉文健同埋羅牧師最後嘅紀念同埋印記。另外，我多謝在3年來嘅全美嘅警察、政界與各界人士對我們嘅關心同埋關懷。同時咧，我感謝紐約市警總局嘅關懷同幫助。我又感謝我各對我哋嘅兒子劉文健嘅不忘，更感謝咧各界對維憲從事着艱巨係咪危險嘅工作執法人員嘅關注，我哋大家嘅支持，多謝。
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for having us here today. As a parent of Detective Wenjian Liu, we strongly believe this act will protect the safety of our law enforcement officers. 3 years ago, this month, my son, Wenjian, and Detective Rafael Ramos died in the line of duty. Thank you for honoring their names in the act. This is the best way to remember them. In addition, we are also grateful to all the police, elected officials, and citizens who cared and helped us get through the past 3 years. We are grateful for the love and help the NYPD has given us. We thank you, everyone, for remembering our son, Wenjian Liu. We want to give special thanks to our law enforcement officers who put their lives on the lines protecting us every day. God bless America. Thank you.
I would like to start by saying an immense thank you to everyone who has worked hard to bring about the Rafael Ramos and Wenjian Liu National Blue Alert Act. Thank you to all the commissioners who will be casting a vote on this very important matter. I would like to extend my gratitude to the FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai, along with the National Blue Alert Coordinating Vince Davenport of the Department of Justice. I would also like to thank former President Barack Obama and former Vice President Joe Biden for their hospitality and for the signing of this act in 2005. My hope is that this alert will prevent another family from having to endure what my family has had to endure in the past 3 years. I truly believe that the work that has gone into making this act possible will save other officers' lives. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce the members of my team from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau who are seated here. Nikki McGinnis, Deputy Bureau Chief, Gregory Cook, Deputy Chief of the Bureau's Policy and Licensing Division, and Linda Pentro, an attorney advisor in the Bureau's Policy and Licensing Division. Ms. Pentro will present the item.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Pai and Commissioners.
Good morning.
As Chief Folks mentioned, today's report and order would add a new Blue Alert Code, BLU, to the current list of authorized codes in the Emergency Alert System. The report and order finds that the Emergency Alert System would be an effective means of delivering blue alerts and that a dedicated event code would facilitate the implementation of blue alerts in a compatible and uniform manner nationwide. This report and order also enables blue alerts to be delivered over the wireless emergency alert system. As with amber alerts and weather alerts, it would be voluntary for state and local officials to send blue alerts, and voluntary for broadcasters and other emergency alert system participants to carry them. Specifically, this report and order establishes that a blue alert could be issued when a law enforcement officer is missing, seriously injured, or killed in the line of duty, or there is an imminent and credible short-term threat to cause death or serious injury to an officer. The suspect must still be at large, and there must be sufficient description of the suspect for the information to be actionable. This report and order encourages stakeholders to work together voluntarily to implement blue alerts as swiftly as possible, and it sets a schedule of 12 months from the effective date of the rules to enable the delivery of blue alerts over the emergency alert system, and a period of 18 months from the effective date of the rules to enable the delivery of blue alerts over the wireless emergency alert system. This implementation schedule would ensure that all stakeholders have sufficient time to address any technical, resource, and training needs for the successful delivery of blue alerts. The Bureau recommends adoption of the item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pentro, for that presentation. Thanks as well. A heartfelt thank you to our other colleagues on the bench for your statements as well. We will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Liu, Ms. Chin, Ms. Ramos. Mr. Liu, I did not need a translator to understand you this morning. I want to thank all of you for traveling to D.C. to take part in this event. Your son, your husband, served their communities with great honor, dedication, and courage. I have no real words to bring comfort to you, but I am pleased to be able to honor you in a small way with the adoption of a rule to promote an alert where there is an incredible threat against a law enforcement officer. We honor their memories this morning in taking an important step to ensure that this agency, which number one mission is public safety, that we will aid you, aid their fellow officers when they're in the line of duty. An estimated 240 million calls are made to 911 centers each year. But when the need arises for one of us to make that dreaded call for help, it is our nation's first responders, your husband and your sons, who dedicated themselves. They stepped up. The officers step up, often at great risk to their own personal safety, in order to ensure our safety. For that, we will always be indebted. So I am thankful to be able to show my support for them to you through today's order, which revises the Commission's Emergency Alert System, or EAS, rules, adding a 3-character Blue Alert event code is the most effective means to share vital information in critical situations involving the serious injury or death of a law enforcement officer in the line of duty. It is our most effective means to provide aid to an officer who may be missing in the connection with his or her duties, or an imminent or credible threat that an individual intends to cause serious injury to or to harm a police officer. These words on the page seem so easy to read before meeting you this morning. But it is important that we do our part as a commission to update this EAS system to facilitate broader dissemination of information that can help keep our first responders safe. And as the City of New York and the National Association of Broadcasters have pointed out, issuing the Blue Alert via this EAS system has the added benefit of further protecting the public from violent suspects. Now I want to thank Lisa, Linda, the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau for their work on this important item. But I want to thank the three of you, supported by your law enforcement family, for coming here and reminding us of just how important, how vital our work is, our commitment is to each and every one of you and this entire nation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I associate myself with my colleagues' good comments there. Mr. Liu, I think you demonstrated to everyone that communications is more than just words. Hopefully our action today provides some small comfort to your family in this immense loss. I'll submit my longer statement, but suffice it to say, I hope and think that we should all pray that the need for this new code never arises. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. I also join my colleagues in the sentiments they've expressed this morning. Thank you all for being here today. With this order, the FCC does its part to help promote the safety of our nation's law enforcement officials and the communities they serve. Last year, 135 officers were killed in the line of duty. In many of the cases, the perpetrators posted imminent, incredible threats to law enforcement officials ahead of time on social media, and some of them may have been thwarted by a coordinated national Blue Alert network. In 2015, Congress directed the Attorney General to create such a network within the Department of Justice and to support state and local law enforcement as they work to develop and implement Blue Alert plans. But the lack of a dedicated event code is one of the primary obstacles to more states using Blue Alerts. Indeed, the DOJ's COPS office has stated that creation of such a code is the single greatest need of the National Blue Alert Network. In today's order, we therefore adopt a new dedicated EAS event code to enable the transmission of Blue Alerts over the EAS and wireless emergency alert systems. This action should facilitate the delivery of Blue Alerts in a uniform and consistent manner nationwide. In the process, increase the reach and effectiveness of these potentially life-saving warnings. I'm pleased the Commission is moving quickly to address this issue. I thank the staff, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau their diligent work. And I also want to join my colleagues again in acknowledging and thanking law enforcement and their families, including those of Wenjin Liu and Rafael Ramos, for all that you've done and all you're doing to help keep us safe. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Today, the Commission honors Rafael Ramos and Wenjin Liu by fulfilling the promise of the National Blue Alert Act, which was signed into law by President Obama in 2015. We create a new emergency alert code, BLU, for use with our public alerting systems when a law enforcement officer is in peril. This new code and these 3 letters have the potential to save lives and increase situational awareness for our first responders. This is good stuff. It has my support. I am going to dissent, however, on one small aspect of today's decision. In evaluating the merits of the Blue Alert system that we adopt today, the Commission puts forward a cost-benefit analysis that weighs the cost of industry compliance against the value of a police officer's life. You heard that right. In deciding whether to impose a requirement under this law, the Commission puts a price on the death of first responders and then nets it out against industry expenses. Fortunately for law enforcement, the math works out. But this cold calculus is neither needed nor smart. There is a way to do cost-benefit analysis thoughtfully and with dignity for those who wear the shield, some of whom sit before us right here, right now. This isn't it. So on this disrespectful analysis, I dissent. But in closing, I want the family members who are here today to know that we cannot understand the depth of your pain. But we are so pleased you're here today to honor your loved ones. Thank you.
Before I begin my formal remarks, I also want to thank the families of Officers Liu and Ramos. I want to thank you for your courage in being here today. And I also want to thank you for sharing some of your time with me this morning. Being able to hear your stories firsthand, being able to see a picture, Ms. Chen, on your phone of your 5-month-old daughter, who will never have a chance to see her father, but whose likeness bears a direct resemblance to that brave soul, was a privilege beyond measure. Thank you for your sacrifice and for being here today. We typically give thanks and celebrate with family and friends during the holidays. But for Maritza, Justin, Jaden, and Angelina Ramos, Cindy Gonzalez, Peixia Chen, Weitang Liu, and Shu Yan Li, who I had a chance to meet as well, every Christmas over the past 3 years has been one more painful reminder of the loss that they suffered on December 20th of 2014. For it was on that day, less than 1 week before Christmas, that detectives Rafael Ramos and Wenjin Liu of the New York Police Department were senselessly gunned down while on duty. They were doing what they loved to do and what they were proud to do, protecting the citizens of New York City. Their dedication exemplifies what it means to be a public servant, to improve their communities and the lives of others, despite the inherent dangers. Detective Ramos, a dedicated Mets fan who had a taste for ham and cheese sandwiches, once told a fellow church member that he wanted to bring something more to the uniform. He sure did. Detective Ramos was scheduled to graduate from the New York State Chaplains Task Force the day after he lost his life. For his part, when Detective Liu was once asked why he wanted to be a police officer, he replied, and I quote, "I know that being a cop is dangerous, but I must do it. If I don't do it, then who is going to do it?" Detectives Ramos and Liu made the ultimate sacrifice. We owe them and their brave family members who have come here today a tremendous debt of gratitude. We cannot begin to fathom your pain, but we can honor your sacrifice. And the FCC attempts to do that today by adopting rules so that police officers across America and the communities they so proudly serve will be better protected. Specifically, we are creating a dedicated Blue Alert event code in the emergency alert system. Similar to the Amber Alerts that many are familiar with, Blue Alerts will enable authorities to warn the public when there is actionable information related to a law enforcement officer who is missing, seriously injured, or killed in the line of duty, or when there's an imminent threat to an officer. These warnings can be sent to the public through broadcasts, cable, satellite, and wireline video providers. Officials may also send Blue Alerts through the wireless emergency alert system to consumers' wireless phones. We aim to promote compatible and integrated Blue Alert plans throughout the United States, consistent with the Rafael Ramos and Wenjin Liu National Blue Alert Act of 2015. 6 months ago, at the Department of Justice, I made a promise to adopt these rules, and I'm pleased that my fellow commissioners and I make good on that promise here today. Obviously, what we do here doesn't change what happened that sad afternoon in New York, but it does respect these officers' spirit and courage. I want to thank William Johnson, Executive Director of the National Association of Police Organizations, for his advocacy and support for Blue Alerts, and especially the family members who are here today. I also want to acknowledge the unwavering support from members of the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, who have joined us this morning. Acting Director and National Blue Alert Coordinator Russell Washington, Deputy National Blue Alert Coordinator Vince Davenport, Senior Counsel to the Director Shanetta Cutler, and Blue Alert Team Leader Tracy Johnson-Farrell. I also want to extend a special thanks to Deputy Chief Thomas Burns, Commanding Officer of the NYPD Employee Relations Section, and his staff, Lieutenant Deborah Lott, Sergeant Patrick Whalen, and Officer Frank Russo. Each of them plays a very important role in consoling grieving family members of fallen NYPD police officers. I'm also grateful to Detective Jose Falero and Sergeant Johnny Yin from the NYPD for safely escorting our guests this morning all the way from New York. And last but not least, for their tireless efforts and dedication to keeping the American people safe, I want to thank our fantastic staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Rochelle Cohen, Greg Cook, Lisa Folks, Nikki McGinnis, Linda Pintro, Austin Randazzo, and James Wiley, and Anjali Singh and David Horowitz from the Office of General Counsel. Thank you for all you've done to get us to this step today. With that, we will call for a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Ricard.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to all of you for your presentation and for your dedication to this effort. Their memory will not be forgotten. Thank you. Madam Secretary, please announce the next item on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item on your agenda, entitled Promoting Telehealth in Rural America, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Monteith, if you and your team are ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
It's very difficult to follow such a moving presentation on such an important issue. The Wireline Competition Bureau presents this morning for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking in order that launches a review of the Commission's Rural Health Care Program. This item seeks to improve the program's efficiency and promote access to vital telehealth services in rural America. I would like to thank the Telecommunications Access Policy Division's team for all their hard work on this proceeding. Our colleagues in the Enforcement Bureau and in the Offices of Communications Business Opportunities General Counsel, Legislative Affairs, and Managing Director, also provided us with invaluable input. With me at the table are Trent Harkrader, Associate Bureau Chief, and from WCB's Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Ryan Palmer, Division Chief, Radhika Karmarkar, Deputy Division Chief, Sumitra Das, Telecommunications Analyst, and Preston Wise, Attorney Advisor. Preston will present the item. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. The FCC's Rural Healthcare Program supports access to vital communications and telehealth services in rural areas, helping those in remote communities access high-quality healthcare and overcome the challenges of hospital closures and shortages in medical professionals. For the second year in a row, however, program demand is likely to exceed available support, leaving participating healthcare providers with unanticipated funding reductions. While advances in healthcare technologies have contributed to growth in the program, this budgetary shortfall may also be attributable to current program rules that promote inefficient purchasing decisions and create opportunities for waste, fraud, and abuse. If adopted, this item would initiate a rulemaking to review the rural healthcare program. The notice of proposed rulemaking would first seek comment on whether to increase the rural healthcare program's current annual $400 million cap and how to prioritize funding should demand exceed the cap in future years. It would then seek comment on proposals to promote efficiency in the program and to curtail waste, fraud, and abuse. These proposals include establishing a process for evaluating outlier funding requests and streamlining the calculation of urban and rural rates, redefining the cost-effectiveness standard across the rural healthcare program to encourage a more transparent and fair competitive bidding process, ensuring sufficient funding for rural and tribal healthcare providers, and ways to simplify program participation and enhancing oversight to, for example, establish rules on the use of consultants, gift restrictions, and invoicing deadlines, among other matters. The order would grant targeted and immediate relief to rural healthcare providers facing potential cuts in funding year 2017. Specifically, it would waive the rural healthcare program's cap on a one-time basis by instructing USAC to carry forward any unused program funds from prior funding years for use in funding year 2017. And it would enable service providers to voluntarily reduce their rates for qualifying funding year 2017 requests while keeping constant the support amount provided by the Universal Service Fund. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits.
Thank you, Mr. Wise and Ms. Monteith. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
When a patient is presenting symptoms of a stroke, physicians have a saying, time is brain. Minutes can make the difference between full recovery and severe permanent damage. That is why the University of Virginia hospital system has put telestroke functionality in ambulances. By ensuring life-saving treatment can begin immediately, the program ensures that strokes are caught at the absolute earliest possible time. This advanced technology would not have been deployed organically, according to the system's director of telehealth. The director stated just a few months ago that absent the rural healthcare program, our ability to provide these services would be severely constrained. Whether it's telepsychiatry solutions for individuals in need of help, or the enabling of remote radiology readings to promote and speed the quality of healthcare, the FCC's rural healthcare program has been a key plank undergirding the modernization of healthcare delivery. Unfortunately, as the FCC's own Connect to Health Task Force has found, most of the counties with the worst access to primary care physicians are also the least connected. And this holds true in both urban and rural areas. That vulnerable grandmother who spends over 2 hours on that local bus system to see a doctor can benefit just as much from telehealth as her rural counterpart. We need to do better as a country, and that can start with a fresh look at our rural healthcare program. Everyone stands to benefit if this program matches the needs of healthcare providers with the patients who rely on them. That means looking at everything from top-line funding levels to the nuts and bolts of program administration. The potential here is huge if we simultaneously reduce healthcare expenditures and improve patient outcomes, but we must get it right. That is why I am pleased my colleagues agreed to include further lines of questioning in the notice of proposed rulemaking. We expand the inquiry to seek comment on how we can incorporate what we have learned from our Connect to Health task force. We look at how best to improve transparency and on how to equitably administer the program in the event funding requests cause us to hit the cap yet again. And we look to understand whether and how to support remote monitoring consistent with our statutory mandate. I always say that we need to make the business case for each and every one of our policies. This rural healthcare program is one where making the business case is incredibly easy. The program saves lives. It reduces costs and results in a healthier nation. Telemedicine consults with high-risk mothers result in an almost 40% reduction in the amount of infant days in NICU. And it is here especially, and I have a personal story to tell about this with a nephew who looks fabulous today but spent 3 months of his life in NICU, where the value proposition is both precious and crystal clear. This item has my enthusiastic report, so I thank the Wireline Competition Bureau for your thoughtful work on reforming the Rural Healthcare Fund. I look forward to continuing to engage with you as we move towards an order that will be a major driver in improving access and outcomes when it comes to healthcare, telehealthcare, telemedicine in America. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and for your leadership on the Connect to Health Task Force.
Thank you for your support in that.
Absolutely. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit a longer statement, but I've seen firsthand the role that the rural health care program can play in promoting the health and safety of Americans in some of the more and most remote parts of the country. One of my first trips as a new commissioner was to Alaska, a telemedicine pioneer and a hotspot by necessity. As I traveled the isolated villages accessible only by air, I saw health aides use what I've called technology triage to assess patients and forward relevant health information to larger facilities in regional cities in Anchorage. While that experience helped illustrate the benefits of the program, I've also had a chance to witness its shortcomings. For years, regulators and recipients complained that the program was underutilized, meaning that it didn't spend every last dollar allowed under the budget cap. Therefore, a prior commission expanded the program to include broadband and marketed the heck out of it. Pushing dollars out the door quickly took precedence over cost effectiveness, and not surprisingly, spending increased rapidly. To be sure, most of this funding has been used for intended purposes, to provide discounted connectivity to rural healthcare providers, improving access for more consumers. However, in some cases, it has been used to buy more capacity than what's actually needed, overbuild other rural providers, and connect sites that were not originally intended to be part of the program. I implored the last commission to put a plan in place, chairman, to put a plan in place to address the spending increases, but my requests were ignored. Now, demand exceeds the cap, and we are left playing catch-up. However, that cannot be an excuse to spend more and reform later. Fortunately, the notice seeks comment on ways to root out inefficiencies and target support where it's needed most. Indeed, I am pleased to see cost-saving ideas from other programs included in the notice. In particular, the item seeks comment on excluding certain expenses outright, examining whether these services are used and useful, and capping or limiting support that exceeds a specific threshold or reasonable comparability benchmark, issues I've spent a great deal of time on in the high-cost program. In fact, I think we're getting real close to announcing new limitations on the extraneous uses of ratepayer funding by rate of return providers. The item also seeks comments on prioritizing certain areas, including based on economic need, which sounds a lot like the means testing concept that Commissioner Clyburn and I have urged the Commission to at least seek comment on in the high-cost program. At the same time, The notice does ask about increasing the spending cap above the current $400 million. I have several concerns with such approach. As a threshold matter, it is my hope that improving program efficiency and targeting of the funds will alleviate or at least decrease the need for more of it. In addition, there seems to be an underlying assumption by some that the budget should be set solely by healthcare demand. That is simply not the right approach. We are not a healthcare agency, and we aren't even part of that realm. What we do through the rural healthcare program can help provide savings on the healthcare side, but we do not have insight into, nor do we recoup any of the savings to help offset our costs. Our job, according to the statute, is to provide a discount to help make already available service more affordable. Funding new networks that potentially overlap and undermine existing infrastructure is expensive and can be wasteful. We have to keep in mind that the Federal Universal Service Program is already authorized to spend approximately $11 billion per year. And there's no shortage of requests for additional funding, as recipients from each of the four programs have requested even more. Instead of looking holistically and finding the necessary offsets, the Commission has tended to increase funding at the expense of consumers. It is time for the Commission to decide how much we reasonably and justifiably should take from ratepayers, then set an overall budget for USF and individual program budgets accordingly. Just recently, some suggested that a separate Commission action was akin to taxing on consumers. But this is actually one, if not officially labeled as one. Hardworking Americans and businesses are charged extra fees on their phone bills in order to fund these programs. There must be a limit on how much we are willing to take from them, no matter how meritorious the spending could be. So let me be clear. I will be extremely reluctant to increase the budget for the rural health care program in any final item without corresponding spending reductions elsewhere. I thank the Chairman and the staff for working with me to include additional questions on the impact of funding increases on consumers. I'm also pleased that the order makes clear that any price reductions undertaken by service providers to help address the current shortfall will be completely voluntarily. I vote to approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. At the FCC, we are focusing a lot of our efforts on closing the digital divide. One area where that divide is particularly stark is healthcare. Americans living in rural communities are falling behind when it comes to the availability of high-quality care. It's difficult to impossible to find specialists in many rural communities, and even basic care is often out of reach as we see rural hospitals closing by the dozen across the country. The FCC's Rural Health Care Program can help make a difference. This program uses money that consumers pay into the Universal Service Fund to subsidize the costs of connectivity that consumers in rural communities need for telemedicine and other advanced healthcare services. But unfortunately, this program is not living up to its potential. Our rules and the incentives they create are not serving the best interests of rural healthcare providers, the communities that depend on them, or the consumers that pay into the Universal Service Fund. At a time when the program is more important than ever to a growing number of rural communities, it's been heading in the wrong direction. In what is known as the telecom portion of the program, we've been spending more money to serve fewer and fewer healthcare institutions. Over the last 3 years, for example, the number of participants in the program dropped by 36%, while requests for funding grew by more than 67%. This means that limited program dollars are starting to concentrate in a small number of healthcare providers that are receiving increasingly large subsidies. Indeed, in 2016, just 5% of the participating healthcare providers received more than half of the available support. In addition to concentrating USF support in fewer communities, the program's trend lines are unsustainable for another reason. It does not encourage or incentivize prudent spending. The 5% of providers that now receive the lion's share of support are getting discounts of over 99% on their services. And the effective program discount has risen from 72% in 2011 to 95% last year. It's no surprise then that demand exceeded the program's budget for the first time in 2016, and that we're expecting to see the same outcome in 2017. So I'm glad the Commission is launching this proceeding to review the program. It's important that our rules incentivize the wise and prudent spending of program funds while ensuring that more Americans, regardless of where they live, have access to advanced telehealth services. As part of this inquiry, I'm pleased that we're now seeking comment on whether to adopt speed or other service benchmarks to ensure that supported services can in fact be used to bring telehealth offerings to rural communities. With this and the range of other questions we tee up, I'm confident that we can craft rules that will promote efficient purchasing decisions. In the interim, I support our decision to provide some immediate relief to healthcare providers that could otherwise face unexpected costs if the program exceeds its budget cap again this year. By waiving our rules, we allow service providers to voluntarily reduce their rates, which can help ensure that rural communities continue to receive service. So thanks to the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for your work on this item. It has my support, and I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I've seen the future through a pair of virtual reality goggles as alarms were blaring in my ears and supervising physicians were urging me to administer CPR in order to save a patient. Now, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on television, but I got to see the future of medical care at the Simulation Training and Education Lab in Northwest Washington, where video game developers work hand in hand with researchers and clinicians to develop training for the MedStar health system. It turns out virtual reality can improve training by leaps and bounds, reducing real-world errors and improving patient outcomes. This is especially true for practitioners in rural and remote areas who lack the resources for regular in-person consultation and training with colleagues. But virtual reality requires bandwidth, and lots of it. Yet today, the Commission program dedicated to ensuring that that bandwidth reaches rural healthcare providers is stretched thin and about to break. There's an honest reason for that. When this program got its start 2 decades ago, neither connectivity nor medicine looked a lot like what they look today. Virtual reality, prescription vending machines controlled by doctors at a distance, and electronic health records were really just the stuff of science fiction. But as I saw at the lab in Washington, today these things have become standard medical training and practice. That's why I am pleased to support today's rulemaking. It examines how to future-proof the Commission's rural health care program, and at the same time it seeks comment on how to responsibly manage the program budget, and to this end it asks some important questions about prioritization. It also seeks comment on improving incentives to promote more efficient decision-making among funding recipients. I am looking forward to the record that develops, and I'm also looking forward to seeing how we can use this program to speed the way for the future of medical care. That would be good news for both patients and practitioners, and also good news for rural America. Thank you to the Bureau for your work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Often in the early mornings, starting in the late 1970s, a doctor in the small town of Parsons, Kansas would hit the road. He would drive long distances across southeast Kansas to make sure that patients in even smaller surrounding communities could see a physician who could help them. That was my dad. And even into adulthood, I remain amazed at the many, many road miles that he has logged in his career. But his upcoming retirement brings into sharp focus, for me, some difficult general trends. It's becoming harder to recruit doctors and to keep them in these rural communities. It's becoming harder to keep rural hospitals afloat. And so it's becoming harder for rural patients to get health care. Ironically, at a moment when vital signs for those patients and rural America generally are suggesting trouble. That's what makes the combination of the internet and rural medicine, call it telemedicine or telehealth if you like, so critical. With a broadband connection, healthcare providers in small-town America can deliver the same quality of healthcare as those in our nation's big cities. And the FCC can and does promote this potential. Our rural healthcare program helps healthcare providers afford the connectivity they need in order to better serve their patients. But it's facing some real problems. First, the program is oversubscribed. The yearly demand for funding now exceeds the annual spending cap. And second, there may be substantial waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. Recent enforcement activity has shown that it is all too easy for unscrupulous companies to manipulate the system for their own profit at the expense of the American taxpayer and the rural healthcare providers that truly need support. So in this notice, we tackled 2 key issues. What size should the program be going forward, and how can it function more effectively? Every dollar in this program needs to be stretched as far as possible to help those in need in places like Southeast Kansas. Thank you to the staff who have worked on this item, specifically Dana Bradford, Regina Brown, Sumitra Das, Mary Beth DeLuca, Trent Harkrader, Belford Lawson, Radhika Karmarkar, Dave Corey, Paul LaFontaine, Billy Layton, Jonathan Lecter, Travis Littman, Rick Mallon, Elizabeth McCarthy, Maura McGowan, Avis Mitchell, Chris Monteith, Linda Oliver, Ryan Palmer, Rakesh Patel, Carol Pomponia, Eric Ralph, Bill Richardson, Ariel Roth, David Sabatkin, Jeffrey Waldow, and last but certainly not least, our presenter, Preston Wise. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn. Aye. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the fantastic job. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. It is entitled Review of Co-locations on Certain Towers Constructed Without Documentation of Section 106 Review, and Don Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you a public notice seeking comment on a plan to exclude from routine historic preservation review the co-location of wireless communications equipment on certain towers known as Twilight Towers. I'm joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Garnet Hanley, Jeff Steinberg, and Dan Margolis. In addition to the WTB staff at the table, I would like to thank Paul Dari, Eli Johnson, and Jill Springer from our Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division for their work, and all of the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Dan will now present the item.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
Good morning.
This public notice would continue the Commission's efforts to streamline wireless infrastructure deployment by seeking comment on a definitive solution for expediting equipment co-locations on so-called Twilight Towers. Twilight Towers are towers that were constructed between March 16, 2001 and March 7, 2005 that either did not complete historic preservation review or that cannot be documented to have completed such review. During that time period, the Commission's historic preservation rules required licensees and applicants to evaluate whether proposed facilities may affect historic properties. But the text of the rule did not specify a particular process that parties were required to follow. The National Historic Preservation Act requires every federal agency, before allowing an undertaking within its jurisdiction to proceed, to consider the undertaking's effects on buildings and sites that are eligible for protection as historic properties. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or the ACHP, has established rules governing the process for conducting historic preservation review. The Advisory Council also has the authority to adopt program alternatives that may be used by federal agencies to exclude from review particular types of federal undertakings that have minimal potential to adversely affect historic properties. Under one such program alternative, the Nationwide Programmatic Agreement, or NPA, for co-location of wireless antennas, most co-locations on towers that themselves underwent historic preservation review are excluded from any further review. But since Twilight Towers lack the documentation of any prior review, co-locations on Twilight Towers are not eligible for the co-location NPA's exclusion from historic preservation review. This public notice seeks public input on a type of program alternative, a draft program comment, that would facilitate co-locations on Twilight Towers by generally excluding from the historic preservation review process co-locations that meet certain specified conditions. If adopted by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, this draft program comment would make potentially thousands of existing Twilight Towers available for co-locations without the need for either the co-location or the underlying tower to complete historic preservation review. The draft program comment thus treats these twilight towers like older towers, constructed before March 16, 2001, which are already excluded from the historic preservation review process. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Margolis. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Our best estimates show today that there are just over 4,000 twilight towers across the United States. To those outside of the world of the communications bar, be happy. Sorry, those in the communications bar. But these are wireless towers for which the historic preservation review process may or may not have been completed. Now, I am sure that those who worked on the 2001 and 2005 nationwide programmatic agreements could not have imagined that mysterious and frustrating questions about the legality of these towers would be the subject of a 2017 proceeding. Nevertheless, as someone's phone goes off, yes, I did tell on you, the approach we are taking through today's public notice seeks to resolve what has become a confounding issue. Program comments present an alternative, streamlined procedure for a co-location applicant to comply with the historic review requirements. In 2013, as acting chair, I saw firsthand how effective program comments could be when I directed the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau to prepare and release one to address towers to deploy positive train control communications. It is important that we design program comments to ensure that tribal nations have a full opportunity to participate in the review of a proposed co-location. In our April 2017 NPRM on facilitating wireless infrastructure deployment, we discussed how tribal nations have expressed concern that some of the twilight towers, which were constructed between 2001 and 2005, may have effects on properties of religious and cultural significance. So I am glad that this program comment makes clear that a tribal nation may request direct government-to-government consultation with the FCC at any time with respect to a twilight tower or co-location. I thank the Bureau for their work on this proceeding and will ask forgiveness to the Bureau Chief for letting everyone know that that was his phone that went off. Thank you.
Fortunately, no one's watching, right? Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. None of us currently on the Commission caused the Twilight Tower situation, which originated back in the early 2000s. Instead, we get the job of cleaning up the mess. Today, we take a decisive first step to do just that. Once complete, our resulting actions will expedite certain antenna co-locations, reduce the need for additional macro tower construction and placement, facilitate the expansion of wireless networks including FirstNet, and improve the wireless experience for consumers. Having toiled on this issue for several years, I'm well aware of some differing perspectives and views on what best to do with twilight towers. Over that time, I've explored assorted options and participated in countless conversations over possible solutions, seeking resolution while demanding a realization of the realities. I've pushed Commission staff, many of whom are no longer here to see this conclusion, to expedite consultations and craft a draft order expeditiously. And I know there have been endless discussions, consultations, negotiations, workshops, and conferences with staff and stakeholders over the years that never resulted in a resolution of the problem. All of this preceding work, however, has led us to this public notice, and I want to thank the Chairman and Commissioner Carr for their leadership in making this issue one of the early action items for removing infrastructure barriers. This PN is an incredibly positive step forward to address the regulatory purgatory faced by those owning so-called twilight towers. These towers, some 4,300 or so by most estimates, as Commissioner Clyburn highlighted, have been in operation bringing wireless service to American people for somewhere between 12 and 16 years. At the same time, owners of these towers, many of which have been since sold, have been stuck, unable to accept co-locating partners while policymakers wrestle with the fact that the requisite historic preservation reviews were not documented. In fact, it is estimated these towers could accommodate an additional 6,500 antennas. Consumers have been prevented from the many benefits from fully loaded towers, including increased network coverage. Since I'm aware of no one that possesses a time machine in order to go back and conduct the reviews pursuant to Commission rules in place today and not back then, we must operate in the present with the facts as they are, not how we may like them to be. Basically, these towers already exist, and in most cases, tough one there, we're never subject to, to a complaint. It would take millions of dollars and years to create a list of all the Twilight Towers and have them individually reviewed. And in the meantime, these towers would continue to be underutilized to the detriment of consumers. With this in mind, as well as the realization that the Commission will not undertake enforcement action against tower owners for the uncertainty caused by our own doing, the public notice takes the most appropriate action by establishing a draft program comment for consideration by the ACHP. Specifically, the contents of the draft program comment would exclude co-locations of wireless facilities on Twilight Towers from Section 106 review. In effect, we are moving forward and closing the sad chapter in regulatory history. I thank the Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Today we take another significant step in our ongoing effort to accelerate and streamline the deployment of wireless infrastructure. Specifically, as we've heard, we propose to resolve what's been a long-standing issue with Twilight Towers. The approach we adopt today will culminate in the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation adopting a document known as a program comment that would exclude co-locations of communications equipment on Twilight Towers from routine historic preservation review. This action could open up thousands of towers for the deployment of new wireless facilities. As such, these towers would be treated similarly to older towers that are already excluded from historic preservation review. We also make clear that the agency will not take enforcement action against Twilight Towers that were constructed in good faith. This clarification further removes the regulatory uncertainty that has hung over these deployments for far too long. I'm grateful as well for the engagement that we've seen on this issue. In response to public input, we make clear in the draft program comment that where a proposed co-location on a Twilight Tower is not excluded from historic preservation review, such review will be limited to the co-location itself and not the underlying tower. We also clarify the standard under which the FCC will treat a request for direct government-to-government consultation, as we've heard, by a tribal nation to be a complaint against a proposed co-location. These clarifications will provide stakeholders with additional certainty, and I thank my colleagues for their willingness to incorporate these changes into the draft program comment. For more than a decade, as we've heard, the FCC and a broad range of stakeholders have debated the best approach for resolving the regulatory status of Twilight Towers. So I'm glad that this Commission is moving forward with a concrete solution that can open up these structures for additional wireless deployments. Doing so will help bring advanced wireless offerings to even more Americans. So I thank the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their hard work on this item and for their broader efforts to streamline the deployment of wireless infrastructure. I look forward to continuing to make progress on these issues in the months to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For too long, towers built during the Twilight period have been caught in a regulatory quagmire. During this 4-year period from 2001 to 2005, both the Commission and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation were adjusting their rules to accommodate the need to facilitate the nationwide building of wireless infrastructure. But before any new policies were put in place, towers were put in the ground, and ever since, these facilities have been stuck in regulatory limbo. Today's proposal doesn't offer the time machine that Commissioner O'Reilly talked about, but it does try to bring an end to this ambiguity and make these towers available for co-location without sacrificing the ability to entertain meaningful objections or engage in tower-specific mitigation. This approach can benefit the First Responder Network Authority and other broadband providers seeking to swiftly deploy new infrastructure. It also can further historic preservation goals by limiting the need for additional towers. But I do think we still have a long way to go to honor our federal trust responsibility to tribal communities impacted by towers constructed during the twilight period. I concur today because I believe that our effort here is well-intended, but falls short of what is required. If we proceed with this draft proposal, I think we need to simultaneously update the Commission's statement of policy on establishing a government-to-government relationship between the agency and federally recognized tribes. This document has not been revisited since it was adopted more than a decade and a half ago. I think it's time to take on this task and do it in conjunction with resolving these long-standing issues of tower construction. In doing so, we can set a clear and updated course for Commission policy while also giving substance to tribal self-determination. And that, I believe, would be worth the effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Similar to the vampires in the Twilight series, for many of us at the Commission, Twilight Towers has seemed like an issue that simply would never die. But no more. Today, I am pleased that after more than a decade, the FCC is finally moving forward to address this longstanding problem. After many discussions with tribal representatives, industry, and other interested stakeholders, it is now clear that it is up to the FCC, working with our colleagues at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or ACHP, to finally solve this problem. And none too soon. The more rapidly we enable the additional use of this infrastructure, the sooner consumers everywhere can benefit from next-generation wireless services. It is my hope that this issue will be wrapped up at long last by the middle of next year. I appreciate the engagement of ACHP staff on this issue and look forward to working with them as we advance this and other wireless infrastructure issues. I would also like to thank my colleagues for their support on this item. In particular, thanks to Commissioner O'Reilly, who has long called for a resolution to this issue, and to Commissioner Carr for his continued leadership on our wireless infrastructure reform docket. And last but most, thanks to the staff who worked on this item. Paul Dari, Garnet Hanley, Eli Johnson, Dan Margolis, Dana Schaefer, Jill Springer, Jeff Steinberg, Don Stockdale, Cecilia Sulhoff, Suzanne Tatro, and Mary Claire York from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Janet Seifert from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Deborah Broderson, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson from the Office of General Counsel. Terrific work by all of you across these bureaus and offices. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Restoring Internet Freedom. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Terrific. Ms. Monteith, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
I think it's still morning, so good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a declaratory ruling, report and order on restoring Internet freedom. The item would eliminate burdensome regulation that stifles innovation and deters investment and empower Americans to choose the broadband Internet access service that best fits their needs. I would like to thank the Competition Policy Division team for their amazing work on this proceeding. We also received invaluable input from our colleagues in the wireless telecommunications, consumer and governmental affairs, enforcement, media, and public safety and homeland security bureaus, as well as from the offices of General Counsel and Strategic Planning. Seated at the table with me from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Madeline Finley, Deputy Bureau Chief, Eric Ralph, Chief Economist, Daniel Kahn, Division Chief, Competition Policy Division, Melissa Kirkle, Assistant Division Chief, CPD, and Deborah Salins, Attorney Advisor, CPD. Joining me at the table from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau are Don Stockdale, Bureau Chief, and Neshe Gundelsberger, Deputy Bureau Chief, and from the Office of Strategic Planning, Jerry Ellig, Chief Economist. Deborah will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
This declaratory ruling, report and order takes several actions to restore Internet freedom. First, the declaratory ruling restores broadband Internet access service to its Title I Information Service classification. The item finds that reclassification as an information service best comports with the text and structure of the Communications Act, Commission precedent, and the Commission's policy objectives. In doing so, the item ends heavy-handed, utility-style regulation of the Internet in favor of a light-touch framework which worked for decades prior to 2015. The declaratory ruling also reinstates the private mobile service classification of mobile broadband Internet access service and returns to the Commission's definition of interconnected service that existed prior to 2015. The item restores the authority of the Federal Trade Commission to enforce consumer protection and antitrust laws. It also clarifies the effects of the return to an information service classification on other regulatory frameworks, including the need to apply a uniform federal regulatory approach to interstate information services like broadband Internet access service. Next, the report and order adopts a transparency rule that would require Internet service providers to disclose information about their practices to consumers, entrepreneurs and other small businesses, and the Commission. The item returns to the transparency rule the Commission adopted in 2010 with certain improvements to promote additional transparency. The report and order would also eliminate the Commission's conduct rules. Based on the record evidence, the item finds that the conduct rules are unnecessary because the transparency requirements, together with antitrust and consumer protection laws, ensures that Internet service providers engaging in behavior inconsistent with an open Internet can be held accountable. The actions taken in this item will advance the Commission's critical work to promote broadband deployment in rural America and infrastructure investment throughout the nation, brighten the future of innovation both within networks and at their edge, and move closer to the goal of eliminating the digital divide. The Bureau recommends adoption of this declaratory ruling, report and order, and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lance, for the presentation, and Ms. Monteith. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Before beginning my statement, Mr. Chairman, I would like to note that Congressman Jerry McNerney, a member of the Congressional Committee that has oversight over this agency, requested the opportunity to speak today. He was denied, but I have a copy of a statement that the congressman would have delivered had he been given the opportunity. And Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I would ask that you include this in official record of this proceeding, if you will allow.
Without objection.
Thank you. I dissent. I dissent from this fierily spun, legally lightweight, consumer-harming, corporate enabling, destroying Internet freedom order. I dissent because I am among the millions outraged. Outraged because the FCC pulls its own teeth, abdicating responsibility to protect the nation's broadband consumers. Now, some may ask, why are we witnessing such unprecedented groundswell of public support for keeping the 2015 net neutrality protections in place? Because the public can plainly see that a soon-to-be toothless FCC is handing the keys to the Internet, one of the most remarkable, empowering, enabling inventions of our lifetime, over to a handful of multi-billion-dollar corporations. And if past is prologue, those very same broadband Internet service providers that the majority says you should trust to do right by you will put profits and shareholders' returns above what is best for you. Each of us raised our hands when we were sworn in as FCC commissioners. We took an oath and promise to uphold our duties and responsibilities to, I liberal quote here, make available so far as possible to all the people of the United States without discrimination a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. Today, the FCC majority is about to officially abandon that pledge, and millions are watching and taking note. I do not believe that there are any FCC or congressional offices immune to the deluge of consumer outcry. We are even hearing about state and local offices fielding calls. And what is newsworthy that at last count, and I think the number is rising, 5 Republican members of Congress went on the record in calling for a halt to today's vote. Why such a bipartisan outcry? Because the large majority of Americans are in favor of keeping strong net neutrality rules in place. But the saddest part to me about all of this, and it's painful for me to say this, that this is the new norm at the FCC, a norm where the majority ignores the will of the people, a norm where the majority stands idly by while the people that they are committed to serve, that they've taken an oath to serve, are about to lose so much. Now, we have heard story after story about what net neutrality means to consumers and small businesses, from places as diverse as Los Angeles Skid Row to Marietta, Ohio. I have here letters that just were sent to me that plead with the FCC to keep our net neutrality rules in place. But what is striking and in keeping with the new norm is that despite the millions of comments, letters, and calls received, this order cites not even one. That speaks volumes about the direction the current majority is heading, this FCC is heading, and that speaks volumes about just who is being heard at the FCC. Those sole proprietors whose entire business models depend on an open internet are worried that the absence of clear and enforceable net neutrality protections will result in higher costs and fewer benefits because, you see, they are not able to pay those tolls for premium access. Large online businesses have also weighed in, expressing concerns about being subject to added charges as they simply try to reach their own customers. Engineers have submitted comments, including many of those internet pioneers. They shared with the FCC majority the fundamentals of how the internet works because from where they sit, there is no way that an item like this would ever see the light of day if the majority understood the platform that some of them helped to create. I have heard from innovators worried that we are standing up a mother may I regime where the broadband provider becomes the arbiter of acceptable online business models. And yes, I have heard from consumers who are worried, given that their broadband providers has already shown that they will charge inscrutable below-the-line fees, raise prices unexpectedly, and put consumers on hold for hours at a time, who will have their best interests at heart in a world without clear and enforceable rules, overseen by an agency without any clear authority. Would that agency be a toothless FCC? Now, there is a darker side to all of this that we have witnessed over the past few weeks. Threats and intimidation, personal attacks, Nazi cheering, Russian influence, fake comments. These are unacceptable. Some of these actions are illegal. They are all to be rejected. But what is also not acceptable is the FCC's refusal to cooperate with the state attorney general's investigations or allow evidence in the record that would undercut what can only be described as a preordained outcome. Now, many have been asking me, what happens next? How will all of this, net neutrality, my internet experience, look after today's decision? My answer is a simple one. When the current protections are abandoned and the rules that have been officially in place since 2015 are repealed, we will have a Cheshire Cat version of net neutrality. We will be in a world where regulatory substance fades to black, and all that is left is a broadband provider's toothy grin, because they have teeth, however you conjugate that. And those also comforting words, we have every incentive, don't worry, we have every incentive to do the right thing. But what they will soon have is every incentive to do their own thing. Now, the results of throwing out net neutrality protections may not be felt right away. Most of us will get up tomorrow morning, get ready for work, and over the next week, wade through what would be, no doubt, hundreds of headlines. We will grow tired of those hundreds of headlines. We will grow tired hearing from endless prognosticators, and we will quickly submerge ourselves into a sea of holiday bliss. But what we have wrought today will one day be apparent, and by then, when you really wake up and see what has changed, I fear it may be too late to do anything about it because there will be no agency empowered to address your concerns. This item insidiously ensures that the FCC will never be able to fully grasp the harm it may have unleashed on the internet ecosystem. And that inability might lead decision makers to conclude that the next internet startup that failed to flourish, that attempted to seek relief by whatever authority may or may not be in charge, with many teeth they might have left, simply that maybe they just had a bad business plan, when in fact the actual culprit was the absence of a level playing field online. Particularly damning is what today's repeal would mean for marginalized groups like communities of color that rely on platforms like the internet to communicate. You see, traditional outlets rarely, if ever, consider their issues or concerns worthy of coverage. It was through social media, remember, that the world first heard about Ferguson, Missouri, because those legacy outlets did not consider them worthy enough for coverage until that hashtag started trending. It has been through online video services that targeted entertainment ecosystems thrive, where stories are finally being told because those very same programs that were submitted for consideration were rejected time and time again by mainstream media and mainstream distribution and media outlets. And it has been through secure messaging platforms where activists have communicated and organized for justice without gatekeepers who may or may not have differing opinions blocking them. Where will the next significant attack on internet freedom come from? Maybe from a broadband provider allowing its network to congest, making a high-traffic video provider ask what more can it pay to make that pain go away? That will never happen, you say? Newsflash, it already has. The difference now is the open question of what is stopping them. The difference after today's vote is that no one will be able to stop them. Maybe several providers will quietly roll out paid prioritization packages that will enable deep pocket players to cut the queue. Maybe a vertically integrated broadband provider decides that it will favor its own apps and services, or some high-value Internet of Things traffic will be subject to an additional fee. Maybe some of these actions will be cloaked under non-disclosure agreements and wrapped up in mandatory arbitration clauses so that it will be a breach of contract to disclose these publicly or take the provider to court if there is any wrongdoing. Some may say, of course this will never happen. But after today's vote, what will be in place to stop any of this? What we do know is that broadband providers did not even wait for the ink to dry on a proposed order before making their moves. One broadband provider who had in the past promised to not engage in pay prioritization has now quietly dropped that promise from its list of commitments on its website. What's next? Blocking or throttling? That will never happen, you say? After today's vote, exactly who is the cop on the beat that can or will stop them? And just who will be impacted the most? Consumers and small businesses, that's who. The internet continues to evolve and has become even more critical for every participant in our 21st century ecosystems. Government services have migrated online, as have educational opportunities, job notices, and applications. But at the same time, broadband providers have continued to consolidate. They have become bigger. They own their own content. They own their own media companies. And they own or have interest in other types of competing services. So why are millions of Americans so alarmed? Because they understand the risk this all poses. And even those who might not exactly know what it means when somebody says Title II authority, what they know is that they will be at risk without it. Now, I've been asking myself repeatedly why the majority is so single-focused on overturning these wildly popular rules. Is it simply because they felt that the 2015 net neutrality order, which threw out over 700 rules, which dispensed with more than 25 provisions, was too heavy-handed? Or is this a ploy to create a need for legislation where there was none before? Or is it to establish uncertainty where little previously existed? Is it a tactic to undermine the net neutrality protections adopted in 2015 that are currently parked at the Supreme Court? You know, the very same rules that were resoundingly upheld by the D.C. Circuit last year? No doubt we will see a rush to the courthouse asking the Supreme Court to vacate and remand the substantive rules that we have fought so hard for over the past few years, because today the FCC uses legally suspect means to clear the decks of substantive protections for consumers and competition. It is abundantly clear why we see so much bad process with this item, because the fix was already in. There is no real mention of the thousands of net neutrality complaints filed by consumers. Why? The majority has refused to put them in the record, while maintaining the rhetoric that there have been no real complaints or no real violations. Record evidence of massive incentives and abilities of broadband providers to act in anti-competitive ways are missing from the docket. Why? Because those in charge have refused to use the data and knowledge the agency does have and has relied on in the past to inform our merger reviews. As the majority has shown time and time again, the views of individuals do not matter, including the views of those who care deeply about the substance, but may not be Washington insiders. There is a basic fallacy underlying the majority's actions and rhetoric today. The assumption of what is best for broadband providers is obviously what is best for America. Breathless claims about unshackling broadband services from unnecessary regulation are only about ensuring that broadband internet service providers have and maintain the keys to the internet. Assertions that this is merely a return to some imaginary status quo ante cannot hide the fact that this is the very first time that the Federal Communications Commission has disavowed substantive protections for consumers online. And when the current 2015 net neutrality rules are laid to waste, we may be left with no single authority with the power to protect consumers. Now, this order loudly crows about handing over authority of broadband to the Federal Trade Commission, but what is absent from the order and glossed over in a haphazardly issued afterthought of a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is that the FTC is an agency with none, nada, technical expertise in telecommunications. The FTC is an agency that may or may not even have authority over broadband providers in the first instance. The FTC is an agency that, if you can even reach a very high bar of proving unfair or deceptive practices and that there is substantial consumer injury, it may take years upon years for any remedy to be levied, and most companies don't have years and years to wait for an answer. But don't just take my word for it. Even one of the FTC's own commissioners has articulated these very concerns. And if you are wondering why the FCC is preempting state consumer protection laws in this item without notice, let me help you with a simple jingle that you can easily commit to memory that will underscore all of this. If it benefits industry, preemption is good. If it benefits consumers, preemption is bad. Reclassification of broadband would do more than wreak havoc over net neutrality. It will also undermine our universal service construct for years to come, something which the order implicitly acknowledges. It will undermine the Lifeline program. It will weaken our ability to support robust broadband infrastructure deployment. And what we will soon find out is what a broadband market unencumbered by robust consumer protections will look like. I suspect that it will not be very pretty. I know that there are many questions on the minds of Americans right now, including what the repeal of net neutrality will mean for them. To help understand or to answer or address outstanding questions, I plan to host a town hall through Twitter next week on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But what saddens me the most today is that the agency that is supposed to protect you is actually abandoning you. But what I am pleased to be able to say today is that the fight to save net neutrality does not end today. The agency does not have the final word. Thank goodness for that. And as I close my eulogy of the 2015 net neutrality rules, carefully crafted rules that actually struck an appropriate balance in providing consumer protections and enabling opportunities and investment, I actually take what I'll just call ironic comfort in the words of then Commissioner Pai back in 2015, because I believe this will ring true about this destroying Internet freedom order. I am optimistic, he said, that we will look back on today's vote as an aberration, a temporary deviation from the bipartisan path that has served us so well. I don't know whether this plan will be vacated by a court, reversed by Congress, or overturned by a future commission, but I do believe that its days are numbered. Amen to that, Mr. Chairman. Amen to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. I'm going to mark you down as a no. So that's Commissioner O'Reilly.
To the main event. I'll have a longer statement if it's believable, since this is long in and of itself. The order before us represents the culmination of extensive work by the agency staff to carefully consider whether net neutrality rules are truly warranted, thoroughly reviewing the legal underpinnings, economic analysis, and practical effects, as debated extensively and exhaustively in the record of this proceeding. I agree with the decision, and I support such a well-reasoned and soundly justified order. While I have longstanding views on this topic, I approached this proceeding with an open mind. I read the substantive comments with interest and met with anyone I could, no matter how of their or what their particular viewpoint. In the end, I'm simply not persuaded that heavy-handed rules are needed to protect against hypothetical harms. In all this time, I've yet to hear recent unquestionable evidence of demonstrable harms to consumers that demands providers be constrained by this completely flawed regulatory intervention. I still cannot endorse guilt by imagination. It is a shame that this topic has been plagued by baseless fear-mongering. Many small businesses have been blatantly misled into thinking that they're going to be forced to pay more to continue to do business online. Others have been told that free speech and civil rights are on the line. It simply isn't true, and we know that from experience. The internet has functioned without net neutrality rules far longer than with them. Nobody can name more than a handful of examples that occurred over the course of an entire decade prior and that were readily dealt with, whether actual violations or not. The legend of a cable company trying to break the internet may make a scary bedtime story for children of telecom geeks, but it isn't reality. So, for those of you out there that are fearful of what tomorrow may bring, please take a deep breath. This decision will not break the internet. What we are doing is reverting back to the highly successful, bipartisan, governmental approach that existed before 2015. As the order makes clear, we depart from the prior Commission's approach because we determined that the decision was flawed. We believe that our statutory interpretation and course of action is the better one, and our decision is grounded in and supported by the record. The text has been publicly available for over 3 weeks, and our good staff has summarized it for us today. So there is no need for me to step through the policies and reasoning again in detail. Instead, I'll highlight a few key parts and address some of the false arguments and misconceptions regarding the substance and process. While repealing net neutrality rules grabs headlines, reversing the classification of broadband internet access service as a Title II telecommunications service is far more consequential. Net neutrality started as a consumer issue, but it soon became a stepping stone to impose vastly more onerous common carrier regulations on broadband companies. Even the previous chairman initially attempted to reinstate net neutrality rules under more limited legal authority, and many companies would have accepted the compromise and lived with net neutrality rules as long as the Commission didn't impose Title II. But thanks to one infamous YouTube video posted by the prior administration, this so-called independent agency was quickly railroaded into treating ISPs like public utilities instead. As discussed at length in the order, and the dissents of Chairman Pai and myself wrote in response to 2015 order, there were fundamental legal problems and factual errors underlying that decision to treat fixed and mobile broadband services as telecommunications services. Additionally, that decision opened the door for much broader regulation of broadband providers, and as we saw, the Commission quickly walked through that door. Under this structure, companies continue to face uncertainty that business decisions, commercial negotiations, service offerings, and pricing decisions would be scrutinized by the Commission. I believe that these legitimate concerns were well-founded, and if there had not been a change in administration, the agency would have proceeded further down the path as demonstrated by its zero-rating witch hunt. The decision to reinstate the classification of both fixed and mobile broadband internet access service as an information service under Section 3 and reinstate the classification of mobile broadband as a private mobile service under Section 332 eliminates these concerns and restores a sensible bipartisan approach to broadband services. Under this framework, the FCC asserts jurisdiction over broadband internet access service as an interstate information service, but applies regulation only to the extent warranted to address specific concrete concerns. With the elimination of Title II, there's no remaining legal basis for the net neutrality bright line rules and general conduct standard, so we must repeal them. In many proceedings before this agency, I've questioned the need for rules that impose costs but do not solve real problems, so the removal is completely appropriate and necessary. That isn't necessarily the end of the story, however. Congress may enact legislation providing new rules and legal authority to support them. I firmly believe that that would be the better course, and the only way to give finality to this issue. I would humbly suggest, however, that the General Conduct Standard remain forever in the ash heap. This policy gave the Commission's Enforcement Bureau unbounded power to make up the rules as it went along, a frightening prospect. Businesses could find themselves subject to investigation without any prior notice that the conduct could be considered a violation. One public interest group even called the catch-all a recipe for overreach and confusion. It was the height of regulatory capriciousness and should never be resurrected. Similarly, I am hopeful that if the Congress does go down this path, it will see merit in rejecting a ban on paid prioritization. Clearly, there are cases today, and many more that will develop in time, in which the option of a paid prioritization offering would be a necessity based on either technology or needs of consumer welfare. I, for one, see great value in the prioritization of telemedicine and autonomous car technology over cat videos. And speaking of autonomous cars, we must ensure that wireless providers can manage their systems. Wireless networks have capacity constraints based on the physics of the spectrum they use. Generally, wireless use is booming, and more Americans are using wireless networks to access the internet. But this is just the beginning. Consider that each autonomous car vehicle is predicted to generate an additional 4 terabytes of data a day, much of which will be carried by wireless networks. It is hard to imagine that some prioritization of traffic will not be necessary, further undermining attempts to ban such practices. Although the order eliminates the bright line rules and general conduct standard, it does leave a version of the transparency requirements in place. In fact, the requirements are more extensive than those first adopted in 2010. While I remain skeptical of the legal authority for them or their value given the FTC's authority and without a mechanism to get them removed. If a business fails to disclose relevant information or its practices differ from what is described, it will be subject to the investigation and enforcement as outlined in the recent FCC-FTC Memorandum of Understanding. But I sincerely doubt that legitimate businesses are willing to subject themselves to a PR nightmare for attempting to engage in blocking, throttling, or improper discrimination. It is simply not worth the reputational cost and potential loss of business. Will I have to accept the decision to rely on Section 257 as authority for the transparency requirements? I do not believe that Section 218 or the provisions of Title III cited in the circulated version of the order should be invoked here. I'm relieved that they've been removed from the item at my request. Lastly, but certainly not least, the order contains a clear declaration that broadband is an interstate information service, and a robust preemption analysis included. The order makes plain that broadband will be subject to uniform national framework that promotes investment and innovation. This is eminently reasonable and completely consistent with the Constitution's Commerce Clause. Broadband service is not confined to state boundaries and should not be constrained by a patchwork of state and local regulations. And this is particularly germane to wireless services, where mobile devices and the transmissions they carry can easily cross state lines. This could have dramatic and drastic results where it was possible for such communications to be prioritized in one state but not in another. A hodgepodge of state rules could severely curtail not only the next generation of wireless systems that we have been working so hard to promote, but also the technologies that may rely on these networks in the future. Accordingly, any laws or regulations that conflict with or undermine the federal broadband policies are preempted. Given my druthers, I would actually have gone further on preemption, but I can only carry the debate so far today. This is not a new or novel position. The 2015 order, also announced a firm intention to exercise our preemption authority to preclude states from imposing obligations on broadband service that are inconsistent with the carefully tailored regulatory scheme. While the rules we adopt today are obviously different than the 2015 order, the concept that we will preempt inconsistent state and local requirements is well established. Although the order does acknowledge an extremely limited state role in enforcing their traditional police powers, state actions that go beyond this realm will be subject to scrutiny and challenge. The order makes clear that any requirements akin to common carrier regulation are barred. At my request, the order also specifies that states may not adopt their own transparency requirements, whether labeled as such or under the guise of consumer protection. I would also view state broadband privacy actions as outside the scope of what is permissible. The purpose of this order is to restore a light touch approach through deregulation. Therefore, any action to increase regulatory burdens on broadband providers would run directly counter to our efforts. I hope that most states and localities would not waste time and resources attempting to push the boundaries, but I realize that some will do so regardless. I expect the agency to be vigilant in identifying and pursuing these cases. I also commit to work closely with the chairman and the general counsel to quash any conflicts that arise. Before concluding, I want to address the atmospherics surrounding the process in this proceeding. I'll start with the number and identity of the comments submitted. Some would like us have us believe that the comment process has been irreparably tainted by the large number of fake comments. That view reflects a lack of understanding about the Administrative Procedure Act. The agency is required to consider and respond to all significant comments in the record. Millions of comments that simply say something along the lines of keep net neutrality or other colorful language we can't say in public, including a couple who referred to me as a potato. Whether...
Wait, stop. Really?
Yeah. Say that I look like a potato. Okay.
Oh. No comment.
I meant it in a good way. Sorry.
Whether or not they are submitted by real people, bots, or honey badgers have no impact on the decision. As the order makes clear, we do not rely on any such comments. To be clear, that does not mean that comments were ignored. I commend staff for the extra effort that they had to sift through these extraneous comments. Many were simply obscenity-laced tirades. Yet the order reflects a careful evaluation and response to all the significant comments, including those that took a different position. Additionally, I disagree with the suggestion the Commission should have held public hearings. Any member of the public that wanted to express a view could have done so through the standard comment process, and many, many, many did. Public hearings may bring about some additional people in a particular location, but is inefficient for the reaching large numbers of interested parties from around the country. Finally, I see no merit in the suggestion that the agency should have delayed this vote until after the Ninth Circuit issues a decision in the en banc of the FTC versus AT&T Mobility case. While the panel decision raised some questions about the FTC's jurisdiction, it was widely viewed with skepticism. Moreover, the court's order granting en banc rehearing of the panel decision rendered it a legal nullity. Therefore, the FTC is not precluded from enforcing ISP's net neutrality commitments. In short, there is no basis for delay. I commend the chairman, his team, our hardworking and diligent staff for their enormous effort to produce an order of this quality and significance. I am sure that this task required long days and much time spent away from family and friends, and I hope that you'll be able to rest and reconnect over the holiday season. It is very deserved, and you'll have my full respect and profound appreciation for your work. I will vote to approve. I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. This is a great day for consumers, for innovation, and for freedom. We're reversing the Obama-era FCC's unprecedented decision to apply Title II regulations to the Internet. I'm proud to help end this 2-year experiment with heavy-handed regulation, this massive regulatory overreach. Prior to the FCC's 2015 decision, consumers and innovators alike benefited from a free and open Internet. This was not because the government imposed utility-style regulation. It didn't. This was not because the FCC had a rule regulating Internet conduct. It had none. Instead, through Republican and Democratic administrations alike, including through the first 6 years of the Obama administration, the FCC abided by a 20-year bipartisan consensus that the government should not control or heavily regulate Internet access. The Internet flourished under this framework. The private sector invested over $1.5 trillion in broadband networks. Consumers were protected and enjoyed the freedom to access the websites and content of their choosing. Every part of the Internet economy benefited, from innovators on the edge to startups and businesses of every size. Title II did not build that. Title II did not create the open internet. And Title II is not the way to maintain it. The FCC's light regulatory touch, coupled with the robust consumer protections we restore today, supported our country's extraordinary internet success story. After a 2-year detour, one that has seen investment decline, broadband deployments put on hold, and innovative new offerings shelved, it's great to see the FCC returning to this proven regulatory approach. Now, there's no doubt that the debate over internet regulation has generated significant public attention, as it should. I, for one, have learned some colorful new turns of phrases through the course of this proceeding. And much of this is no surprise. Americans cherish the free and open internet. But when it comes to this proceeding, far too many are simply fanning the false flames of fear. The apocalyptic rhetoric is quite something, even by Washington standards. No, the FCC is not ending the internet, or as President Obama's first Federal Trade Commission chairman recently put it, the sky isn't falling, consumers will remain protected, and the internet will flourish. What we're doing with today's vote is reversing a 2-year-old decision and returning to a tried and true regulatory framework, one that we know from our own experience works for consumers and for innovation. Many of the myths that are out there go to what I call the great Title II head fake, which is attributing to Title II things that it simply does not do. Some claim, for instance, that Title II is preventing ISPs from selling bundled or curated plans that offer access to only a portion of the internet. It's not true. The FCC expressly stated that Title II, right now, allows providers to do just that. Some claim that Title II is preventing ISPs from increasing their prices for broadband, so they're going to see a spike immediately after this decision. But the FCC emphasized that its Title II decision involves, quote, no rate regulation. And some claim that Title II is preventing ISPs from blocking, throttling, or engaging in paid prioritization. This is also not true. The D.C. Circuit said that Title II allows ISPs to, quote, block websites, to, quote, throttle applications chosen by ISPs, and, quote, to filter content into fast lanes and slow lanes based on ISPs' commercial interests, provided that they disclose those practices. In other words, Title II is not the thin line between where we are right now and some Mad Max version of the internet. There are reasons that consumers enjoyed a free and open internet long before Title II. There are reasons why consumers are free to access any website or online content of their choosing, and those reasons will continue to hold true long after our Title II experiment ends today. What are they? Well, the D.C. Circuit has offered its view. When it observed that Title II allows ISPs to offer filtered internet access, it also said that none were doing so because of what it said as fear of subscriber losses. In other words, market forces, not the Title II rules, are regulating this conduct. Now, there are some that will never accept market forces as a solution, either in the broadband marketplace or otherwise. But for them, today's order has some more good news. We're not relying on market forces alone. We're not giving ISPs free rein to dictate your online experience. Our decision today includes powerful legal checks. First, Americans will enjoy robust online protections. When the FCC classified broadband as a Title II Title II service in 2015, it divested the Federal Trade Commission of 100% of its consumer protection authority over ISPs, including its ability to police ISPs that engage in unfair or deceptive practices. Repealing Title II will restore important protections for internet openness. Second, consumers will regain strong online privacy protections. Before the FCC stripped it of jurisdiction, the FTC, the nation's most experienced privacy enforcement agency, brought over 500 privacy enforcement actions, including against ISPs. By reversing Title II, consumers get those privacy protections back. Third, federal antitrust law will protect against discriminatory conduct by ISPs. As a former Obama administration FTC chairman recently said, this is a formidable hammer against anyone who would harmfully block, throttle, or prioritize traffic. Fourth, state consumer protection laws will apply and state attorney generals can bring actions against ISPs. These authorities will provide another strong set of legal protections against unfair business practices by ISPs. In short, this is no free-for-all. This is no Thunderdome. The FCC is not killing the internet. While I've spent most of my time today talking about the policy debate surrounding Title II, there's also a threshold legal question that the Commission must answer. Does Internet Access Service qualify as a Title I information service or Title II telecommunications service? Thankfully, I don't need to go beyond what the order itself says on this point. After all, in 2005, the Supreme Court expressly found that the FCC has authority to classify Internet Access Service as a Title I service. This remains the only classification blessed by the Supreme Court. So our decision today rests on sound legal footing. In closing, I want to look back 2 years ago to 2015 one more time. In October of that year, long before I became a commissioner, I gave a speech where I talked about the FCC's then recent Title II decision. I ended that speech by saying this: I'm optimistic the U.S. will return to the successful, light touch approach to the internet that spurred massive investments in our broadband infrastructure. Efforts are underway in both the courts and Congress to reverse the FCC's decision. And following next year's presidential election, the composition of the FCC could be substantially different than it is today. Now, 2 years ago, I certainly did not imagine that I would be part of the FCC's new composition. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity to serve, and I'm grateful that my optimism back then has proven to be well-founded. I'm glad to cast my vote today in favor of internet freedom. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Okay. Net neutrality is internet freedom. I support that freedom. I dissent from this rash decision to roll back net neutrality rules. I dissent from the corrupt process that has brought us to this point, and I dissent from the contempt this agency has shown our citizens in pursuing this path today. This decision puts the Federal Communications Commission on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the law, and the wrong side of the American public. The future of the internet is the future of everything. That is because there is nothing in our commercial, social, or civic lives that has been untouched by its influence or unmoved by its power. And here in the United States, our internet economy is the envy of the world. This is because it rests on a foundation of openness. That openness is revolutionary. It means you can go where you want and do what you want online without your broadband provider getting in the way or making choices for you. It means every one of us can create without permission, build community beyond geography, organize without physical constraints, consume content we want, when and where we want it, and share ideas not just around the corner, but across the globe. I believe it is essential that we sustain this foundation of openness, and that is why I support net neutrality. Net neutrality has deep origins in communications law and history. In the era when communications meant telephony, every call went through, and your phone company could not cut off your call or edit the content of your conversations. This guiding principle of non-discrimination meant you were in control of the connections you make. This principle continued as time advanced, technology changed, and internet access became the dial tone of the digital age. So it was 12 years ago when President George W. Bush was in the White House that this agency first put its net neutrality policies on paper. In the decade that followed, the FCC revamped and revised its net neutrality rules, seeking to keep them current and find them a stable home in the law. In its 2015 order, the FCC succeeded because in the following year, in a 184-page opinion, the agency's net neutrality rules were fully and completely upheld in court. So our existing net neutrality policies have passed court muster. They are wildly popular. But today we wipe away this work, destroy this progress, and burn down time-tested values that have made our internet economy the envy of the world. As a result of today's misguided action, our broadband providers will get extraordinary new powers. They will have the power to block websites, the power to throttle services, and the power to censor online content. They will have the right to discriminate and favor the internet traffic of those companies with whom they have a pay-for-play arrangement, and the right to consign all others to a slow and bumpy road. Now, our broadband providers will tell you they will never do these things. They say, just trust us. But know this, they have the technical ability and business incentive to discriminate and manipulate your internet traffic. And now this agency gives them the legal green light to go ahead and do so. This is not good. Not good for consumers, not good for businesses, not good for anyone who connects and creates online. Not good for the democratizing force that depends on openness to thrive. Moreover, it is not good for American leadership on the global stage of our new and complex digital world. I'm not alone with these concerns. Everyone from the creator of the World Wide Web to religious leaders, to governors and mayors of big cities and small towns, to musicians, to actors, to actresses, to entrepreneurs and academics and activists have registered their upset and anger. They are reeling at how this agency could make this kind of mistake. They are wondering how it could be so tone-deaf. And they are justifiably concerned that just a few unelected officials could make such a vast and far-reaching decision about the future of the internet. So after erasing our net neutrality rules, what is left? What recourse do consumers have? We're told, don't worry, competition will save us. But the FCC's own data show that our broadband markets are not competitive. Half the households in this country have no choice of broadband provider. So if your broadband provider is blocking websites, you have no recourse. You have nowhere to go. We're told, don't worry, the Federal Trade Commission will save us. But the FTC is not the expert agency for communications. It has authority over unfair and deceptive practices. But to evade FTC review, all any broadband provider will need to do is add new provisions to the fine print in its terms of service. In addition, it is both costly and impractical to report difficulties to the FTC. By the time the FTC gets around to addressing them in court proceedings or enforcement actions, it's fair to assume that the startups and small businesses wrestling with discriminatory treatment could be long gone. Moreover, what little authority the FTC has is now under question in the courts. We're told, don't worry, state authorities will save us. But at the same time, the FCC all but clears the field with sweeping preemption of anything that resembles state or local consumer protection. If the substance that got us to this point is bad, the process is even worse. Let's talk about the public record. The public has been making noise, speaking up, raising a ruckus. We see it in the protests across this country, those that are outside here today, and we see it how they have lit up our phone lines, clogged our email inboxes, and jammed our online comment system. Now that might be messy, but whatever our disagreements are on this dais, I hope we can agree that that is democracy in action and something we can all support. To date, nearly 24 million comments have been filed in this proceeding. There is no record in the history of this agency that has attracted so many filings. but there's something foul in this record. 2 million comments feature stolen identities. 500,000 comments are from Russian email addresses. 50,000 consumer complaints are inexplicably missing from the record. I think that's a problem. I think our record has been corrupted and our process for public participation lacks integrity. 19 state attorneys general agree. They have written us demanding we halt our vote until we investigate and get to the bottom of this mess. Identity theft is a crime under state and federal law. And while it is taking place, this agency has turned a blind eye to its victims and callously told our fellow law enforcement officials it will not help. This is not acceptable. It's a stain on the FCC and this proceeding. This issue is not going away. It needs to be addressed. Finally, I worry that this decision and the process that brought us to this point is ugly. It's ugly in the cavalier disregard this agency has demonstrated to the public, the contempt it has shown for citizens who speak up, and the sheer disdain it has for public opinion. Unlike its predecessors, this FCC has not held a single public hearing on net neutrality. There is no shortage of people who believe Washington is not listening to their concerns, their fears, and their desires. Add this agency to that list. Now, I too am frustrated, but here's a twist. I hear you. I listen to what the callers to my office are saying. I read the countless individually written emails in my inbox, the posts online, and the very short and sometimes very long letters. And I'm not going to give up. And neither should you. If the arc of history is long, we are going to bend this toward a more just outcome. In the courts, in Congress, wherever we need to go to ensure that net neutrality stays the law of the land. Because if you are conservative or progressive, you benefit from internet openness. If you come from a small town or a big city, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a company or a nonprofit, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a startup or an established business, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a consumer or a creator, you benefit from internet openness. And if you believe in democracy, you benefit from internet openness. So let's persist, let's fight, let's not stop here or now. It's too important. The future depends on it.
Thank you, Commissioner. The internet is the greatest free market innovation in history. It's changed the way we live, the way we play, the way we work, the way we learn, the way we speak. During my time at the FCC, I've met with entrepreneurs in South Dakota who have started businesses. I've met with doctors in Ohio who have helped care for patients. I've met with teachers in Alaska who have educated their students. I've met with farmers in Missouri who have increased their crop yields. And I've met with many more who have succeeded, all because of the internet. And the internet has enriched my own life immeasurably. In the past few days alone, I have set up a FaceTime call with my parents and kids. I've downloaded interesting podcasts about blockchain technology. I've ordered a burrito. I've managed my playoff-bound fantasy football team. And, as many of you might have seen, I've tweeted. What is responsible for the phenomenal development of the internet? Well, it certainly wasn't heavy-handed government regulation. Quite to the contrary. At the dawn of the commercial internet, President Clinton and a Republican Congress agreed that it would be the policy of the United States to, and I quote, preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the internet, unfettered by federal and state regulation. This bipartisan policy worked. Encouraged by light touch regulation, America's private sector invested over $1.5 trillion to build out fixed and mobile networks throughout the United States. 28K modems gave way to gigabit fiber. Innovators and entrepreneurs grew startups into global giants. and America's internet economy became the envy of the entire world. And this light touch approach was good for consumers, too. In a free market full of permissionless innovation, online services blossomed. Within a generation, we have gone from email as the killer app to high-definition video streaming. Entrepreneurs and innovators guided the internet far better than the clumsy hand of government ever could have. But then, in early 2015, the FCC, under political pressure, jettisoned the successful bipartisan approach to the internet. On express orders from the previous White House, the FCC scrapped the tried and true light touch regulation of the internet and replaced it with heavy-handed micromanagement. It decided to subject the internet to utility-style regulation, designed in the 1930s to govern Ma Bell. This decision was a mistake. For one thing, there was no problem to solve. The internet wasn't broken in 2015. We were not living in some digital dystopia. To the contrary, the internet is one thing, perhaps the only thing in American society that we can all agree has been a stunning success. Not only was there no problem, this solution hasn't worked. The main complaint consumers have about the internet is not and has never been that their internet service provider is blocking access to content. It's that they don't have access at all or not enough competition. These regulations have ironically taken us in the opposite direction from these consumer preferences. Under Title II, investment in high-speed networks has declined by billions of dollars. Notably, this is the first time that such investment has declined outside of a recession in the internet era. When there is less investment, that means fewer next-generation networks are built. That means less access and less competition. That means fewer jobs for Americans building those networks. And that means more Americans are stranded on the wrong side of the digital divide. And the impact has been particularly serious for smaller internet service providers. They don't have the time, the money, or the lawyers to navigate a thicket of complex rules. Now, they don't get a lot of press, certainly not here in Washington. But I've personally visited some of them, from Spencer Municipal Utilities in Spencer, Iowa, to Wave Wireless in Parsons, Kansas. I have personally spoken with many more, from Amplex Internet in Ohio to Airlink Services in Oklahoma. And so it is no surprise that the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, which represents very small fixed wireless companies that typically operate in rural and low-income urban areas, surveyed its members and found that over 80%, quote, incurred additional expense in complying with the Title II rules, had delayed or reduced network expansion, had delayed or reduced services, and had allocated budget to comply with the rules. Other small companies, too, have told the FCC that these regulations have forced them to cancel, delay, or curtail fiber network upgrades. And nearly 24 small providers submitted a letter saying that the FCC's heavy-handed rules affect our ability to find financing. Now remember, these are not the big guys. These are the small companies, the kinds of companies that are critical to providing a more competitive marketplace. Now these rules have also impeded innovation. One major company, for instance, reported that it put on hold a project to build out its out-of-home Wi-Fi network due to uncertainty about the FCC's regulatory stance. And a coalition of 19 municipal internet service providers, that is, city government-owned nonprofits, have told the FCC that they, and I quote, often delay or hold off from rolling out a new feature or service because they cannot afford to deal with a potential complaint and enforcement action. None of this is good for consumers. We need to empower all Americans with digital opportunity, not deny them the benefits of greater access and competition. And consider, too, that these are just the effects that these rules have had on the internet of today. Think about how they will affect the internet that we need 10, 20 years from now. The digital world bears no resemblance to a water pipe or an electric line or a sewer. The use of those pipes will be roughly constant over time. And very few would say that there's been dramatic innovation in these areas. By contrast, online traffic is exploding, and we consume exponentially more traffic and data over time. With the dawn of the Internet of Things, with the development of high bitrate applications like virtual reality, with new activities that we can't fully grasp yet, like high-volume Bitcoin mining, we are imposing ever more demands on the network. And over time, that means our networks themselves will need to scale too. On advice of security, we need to take a brief recess.
Everyone, I need everyone to leave everything that you have in place. Do not take anything out of here except for your body. Do not take any bags, any books, or anything.
came in, took a piss, walked right back.
All right, if you were in the main room, you may go back in.
Sorry for the interruption. We were acting on the recommendation of the Federal Protective Service, but we can now reconvene. Where was I? Consider, too, that these are just the effects that our rules have had on the Internet of today. Now, think about how they'll affect the Internet that we need 10, 20 years from now. The digital world bears no resemblance to a water pipe or electric line or sewer. The use of those pipes will be roughly constant over time, and very few would say that there's dramatic innovation in those areas. By contrast, online traffic is exploding, and with the dawn of the Internet of Things, with the development of high bitrate applications like virtual reality, with new activities we can't fully grasp yet, like high-volume Bitcoin mining, we are imposing ever more demands on the network. Over time, that means that our networks themselves will have to scale too. But they don't have to. If our rules deter the massive infrastructure investment that we need, eventually we'll pay the price in terms of less innovation. Consider these words from Ben Thompson, a highly respected technology analyst, from a post on his blog Stratechery supporting my proposal. It's an extended quote, but with your indulgence, it's important. The question that must be grappled with is whether or not the Internet is done. By that I mean that today's bandwidth is all we will ever need, which means we can risk chilling investment through prophylactic regulation and the elimination of price signals that may spur infrastructure build-out. If we are done, then the potential harm of a Title II reclassification is much lower. Sure, ISPs will have to do more paperwork, but honestly, they're just a bunch of mean monopolists anyways, right? Best to get laws in place to preserve what we have. But what if we aren't done? What if virtual reality with dual 8K displays actually becomes something meaningful? What if those imagined remote medicine applications are actually developed? What if the Internet of Things moves beyond this messy experimentation phase and into real-time value generation, not just in the home, but in all kinds of unimagined commercial applications. I certainly hope we will have the bandwidth to support all of that. I do too. And as Thompson put it in another Stratechery post, and again I quote, "The fact of the matter is there is no evidence that harm exists in the sort of systematic way that justifies heavily regulating ISPs. The evidence does suggest that current regulatory structures handle bad actors perfectly well. The only future to fear is the one we never discover, because we gave up on the approach that already has brought us so far." Now remember, folks, networks don't have to be built. Risks don't have to be taken. Capital doesn't have to be raised. The costs of Title II today may appear, at least to some, to be hidden, but the consumers and innovators of tomorrow will pay a severe price. So, what is the FCC doing today? Well, quite simply, we are restoring the light touch framework that has governed the internet for most of its existence. We are moving from Title II to Title I. Wonkier it cannot be. It is difficult to match that mundane reality to the apocalyptic rhetoric that we have heard from Title II supporters. And as the debate has gone on, their claims have gotten more and more outlandish. So let's be clear. Returning to the legal framework that governed the internet from President Clinton's pronouncement in 1996 until 2015 is not going to destroy the internet. It is not going to end the internet as we know it. It is not going to kill democracy. It is not going to stifle free expression online. If stating these propositions alone doesn't demonstrate their absurdity, our internet experience before 2015 and our internet experience tomorrow, once this order passes, will prove them so. Simply put, by returning to the light touch Title I framework, we are helping consumers and promoting competition. Broadband providers will have stronger incentives to build networks, especially in unserved areas, and to upgrade networks to gigabit speeds and 5G. This means there will be more competition among broadband providers. It also means more ways that startups and tech giants alike can deliver applications and content to more users. In short, it is a freer and more open internet. And we also promote much more robust transparency among ISPs than existed 3 years ago. We require ISPs to disclose a variety of business practices, and the failure to do so subjects them to enforcement action. This transparency rule will ensure that consumers know what they're buying and startups get the information they need as they develop new products and services. Moreover, we empower the Federal Trade Commission to ensure that consumers and competition are protected. 2 years ago, the Title II order stripped the FTC of jurisdiction over broadband providers. But today, we are putting the nation's premier consumer protection cop back on the beat. The FCC will once again have the authority to take action against internet service providers that engage in anti-competitive, unfair, or deceptive acts. As FTC Chairman Maureen Olhausen recently said, and I quote, "The FTC's ability to protect consumers and promote competition in the broadband industry isn't something new and far-fetched. We have a long-established role in preserving the values that consumers care about online." Or, as President Obama's first FTC chairman put it just yesterday, "The plan to restore FTC jurisdiction is good for consumers. The sky isn't falling, consumers will remain protected, and the internet will continue to thrive." So let's be clear. Following today's vote, Americans will still be able to access the websites they want to visit. They will still be able to enjoy the services they want to enjoy. There will still be cops on the beat guarding a free and open internet. This is the way things were prior to 2015, and this is the way they will be once again. Now, our decision today will also return regulatory parity to the internet economy. Now, some Silicon Valley platforms, giants, favor imposing heavy-handed regulations on other parts of the internet ecosystem. But all too often, they don't practice what they preach. Edge providers regularly block content that they don't like. When you go online, do you decide what news, search results, and products you see? Perhaps not. They regularly decide what you see and, perhaps more importantly, what you don't. And many thrive on the business model of charging to place content in front of eyeballs. What else is accelerated mobile pages or promoted tweets, but prioritization. What is worse, there is no transparency into how decisions that appear inconsistent with an open internet are made. How does a company decide to restrict someone's accounts or block their tweets because it thinks their views are inflammatory or wrong? How does a company decide to demonetize videos from political advocates without any notice? How does a company expressly block access to websites on rival devices or prevent dissidents' content from appearing on its platform? How does a company decide to block from its app store a cigar aficionado app, apparently because the company believes that the app promotes tobacco use? You don't have any insight into any of these decisions, and neither do I. Yet these are very real, actual threats to an open internet. Ironic, coming from the very entities that claim to support it. Ironic, too, that so-called net neutrality advocates, most vigorously opposed to our reforms, have little to nothing to say about these threats. These are omissions, these are threats that a growing number of officials, Democrat and Republican, House and Senate, are beginning to take notice of. Now look, perhaps certain companies support saddling broadband providers with heavy-handed regulations because those rules work to their economic advantage. I don't blame them for taking that position. And I'm not saying that these same rules should be slapped on them too. What I am saying is that it is not the job of the government to be in the business of picking winners and losers in the internet economy. We should have a level playing field and let consumers decide who prevails. Now, many words have been spoken during this debate, but the time has come for action. It is time for the internet once again to be driven by engineers and entrepreneurs and consumers, rather than lawyers and accountants and bureaucrats. It is time for us to act to bring faster, better, and cheaper internet access to all Americans. It is time for us to return to the bipartisan regulatory framework under which the internet flourished prior to 2015. It is time for us to restore internet freedom. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the staff who have worked so many long hours on this item. From the Wireline Competition Bureau, Anik Banoun, Joe Calishone, Megan Capasso, Paul Exech, Ben Childers, Nathan Egan, Madeline Finley, Doug Galby, Dan Kahn, Melissa Kirkle, Gail Krutov, Susan Lee, Ken Lynch, Pam Megna, Chris Monteith, Ramesh Nagarajan, Eric Ralph, Deborah Salons, Shane Taylor. From the Office of General Counsel, Ashley Boisel, Jim Carr, Christine Fargetstein, Tom Johnson, Doug Klein, Marcus Mayer, Scott Novak, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson. From the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Stacy Ferraro, Neshe Gundelsberger, Garnet Hanley, Betsy McIntyre, Jennifer Salas, Paroma Sanyal, Jimmy Shang, Don Stockdale, and Peter Trachtenberg. From the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, Eric Berger, Mark Bykowski, and Jerry Ellig. From the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Jerusha Burnett. From the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Ken Carlberg. And from the Media Bureau, Tracy Walden. With that, we will call the vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
I dissent.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for your terrific work on this item. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and is entitled Amendment to Harmonize and Streamline Part 20 of the Commission's Rules Concerning Requirements for Licensees to Overcome a CMRS Presumption. Don Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, once you and your folks are arranged, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, may I interrupt a little? I just want to know if his telephone's off.
Commissioner, I did turn it off. Thank you for reminding me.
Vibrate would have been fine. That's all right.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I am pleased to present to you the CMRS Presumption Report and Order. I am joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Roger Noel, Kathy Harris, Tom Reed, and Jessica Griffenius. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Tom Reed will now present the item.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
We present to you today a report and order that updates and harmonizes our regulations regarding the classification of commercial mobile radio services and private mobile radio services, primarily by eliminating sections 20.7 and 20.9 of the Commission's rules. These rules classify or presume certain services to be either commercial mobile radio services, or CMRS, or private mobile radio services, or PMRS, based on the frequency band used to provide service rather than on the characteristics of the service provided. That approach is premised on a paradigm developed more than 20 years ago when the Commission's rules contemplated distinct wireless services in each band. It is inconsistent, however, with the Commission's current flexible approach to licensing, which generally permits a licensee to provide any service it wishes subject to the technical rules and service for that band. This report and order will remove any presumptions about whether mobile services are regulated as commercial or private, and instead allow licensees to rely on the statutory definitions of those terms to identify the nature and regulatory treatment of their mobile services consistent with applicable service rules. Eliminating 20.7 and 20.9 will reduce disparate regulatory treatment of similar services in different frequency bands. It will allow licensees to offer a variety of services rapidly in response to consumer demands and competitive forces, and it will help bring beneficial services to businesses, state and local governments, and the public safety community while reducing the administrative burdens and processing delays that certain providers of these services currently face. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reed, for that compelling presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. What I'm about to say is reinforced if the cameras were to look at the rear of the room. If the topic of Part 20 of the Commission's rules were introduced at the average American dinner table, it might go over as well as a serving of Rocky Mountain oysters. Neither would be warmly received at my home.
Man, that's just wrong. Even we have limits here, Commissioner.
Okay. The changes proposed in this order, coupled with the majority's dismantling of the open internet, you know it would end soon, have many unsavory implications for the future of competition policy. You're wondering how I was going to tie that in, right? As I made clear in my statement opposing the rollback of our open internet rules, I believe the proper interpretation of Section 332 of the Communications Act is that mobile broadband internet access service should be classified as a commercial mobile radio service, or CMRS, not a private mobile radio service. Eliminating our current Part 20 rules means we will remove precedent and procedures that could help parties demonstrate that a wireless company's mobile broadband service should be classified as CMRS. I understand that some may see this as a mere streamlining of commission rules, but in my opinion, this order removes important procedural safeguards, such as requiring the Commission to put certain applications out on public notice, which can help inform parties who are interested in challenging a company's claim that its mobile broadband internet access services should be classified as a private mobile radio service. And since that result is inconsistent with my view of proper classification for mobile broadband services, I respectfully dissent from the order and will admit my first example might have been a little edgy. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank the staff for the work, no statement.
Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The United States leads the world in wireless. One of the reasons for this success is the FCC's decision to embrace a flexible use policy for spectrum. Instead of mandating that a particular...
It's an emotional topic.
Choked up on this one. Instead of mandating that a particular spectrum band be used with a specific type of wireless technology or service, we generally leave that choice to the private sector, which has a much better sense of consumer demand. This approach has enabled wireless networks in the U.S. to evolve with technology and to do so much more quickly than if operators had to obtain government sign-off at each step of the way. Our leadership in 4G is just one example of how this policy has worked to benefit consumers. Today, we carry that approach forward by eliminating 20-year-old rules that reflect a different approach to spectrum, one that required providers operating in particular spectrum bands to obtain FCC permission before innovating or bringing certain services to the market. This change will not only help level the regulatory playing field for wireless providers, but it will also result in more timely and efficient use of spectrum. The flexibility we provide today will be particularly important as we look to extend our global leadership in wireless as 5G and Internet of Things offerings continue to come online. I support the order and hope that we can continue the agency's efforts to identify and eliminate outdated and unnecessary regulatory burdens. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenbristle.
Well, in the interest of moving this along, I will say that I support today's decision. It does not in any way alter the statutory definitions of CMRS or PMRS, nor does it affect the underlying regulatory obligations associated with those services, and that is why it has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. I too support the item, as you might guess. This is as common sense and good government measure as you will find, and it simply finalizes the proposal that we unanimously adopted just last year. So without further ado, I want to thank the staff for their work to help us modernize these rules to get us to this point. In particular, thanks to Jessica Ruffenius, Kathy Harris, Roger Noel, Tom Reed, Jennifer Salas, and Peter Trachtenberg from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Jennifer Gilsonen and Carl Kinsinger from the International Bureau, Jim Bradshaw from the Media Bureau, Christine Fargetstein from the Wireline Competition Bureau, Michael Connolly and Michael Wilhelm from the Public Safety Bureau, Shanna Wilkerson from the Office of Communication Business Opportunities, and David Horowitz and Anjali Singh from the Office of General Counsel. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn?
Nay.
Commissioner Riley?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenbristle?
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Great work by everybody. Thanks. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the sixth item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Electronic Delivery of Cable and Satellite Communications, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thanks, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, whenever your team's ready, go for it.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners.
Afternoon.
As part of our Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, the Media Bureau presents a notice of proposed rulemaking that addresses ways to modernize rules that require multi-channel video programming distributors to provide written notifications to their subscribers, as well as rules that require broadcast television stations to send carriage election notices via certified mail. Joining me at the table are Martha Heller and Maria Malarkey from the Media Bureau. Maria will present the item.
Great.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I am pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes to modernize rules that require multi-channel video programming distributors to provide written information to their subscribers about various topics in ways that would better comport with today's technology, would be more convenient for subscribers, and would be less burdensome for such entities. The notice proposes to adopt a rule that would allow cable operators to deliver various types of general written communications to subscribers by email, subject to certain consumer safeguards. The notice tentatively concludes that cable operators must have verified email contact information if they choose to deliver the notifications to subscribers via email. For certain notices, it tentatively concludes that cable operators must provide a mechanism for subscribers to opt out of email delivery and continue to receive paper notices. For notices that pertain to rate and service changes, among other things, the notice seeks comment on whether subscribers should have to opt in or opt out to receive such notices electronically. The notice also proposes to adopt a rule specifying that the privacy notifications that cable, satellite, and open video system providers are statutorily required to provide to subscribers may be delivered via email, subject to consumer safeguards. The notice also seeks comment on whether cable operators should be permitted to provide certain annual subscriber notices and information on basic tier availability by posting the written material on the cable operator's website. In addition, the notice proposes to allow cable operators to respond to consumer requests or billing dispute complaints by email if the consumer used email to make the request or complaint, or if the consumer specifies email as its preferred delivery method in the request or complaint. The notice seeks comment on other proposals to update sections 76.1621 and 76.1622 of the Commission's rules, which require notice of equipment compatibility issues in light of technological advances and market changes in the cable industry. Finally, The notice seeks comment on how to update the requirement that broadcast television stations send carriage election notices via certified mail every 3 years to each cable system or satellite carrier serving its market. It asks what alternative means of serving election notices would meet the needs of both broadcasters and MVPDs, such as express delivery service or email. The MPRM also seeks comment on whether to replace the requirement to send election notices by certified mail with a mechanism for providing notice of carriage election online. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malarkey, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
Have you ever felt that you need to get an advanced degree to even come close to interpreting your monthly cable bill? Between annual price hikes, channel lineup changes, and mysteriously labeled fees, rest assured you are not alone in your frustration. According to one analyst, between 2011 and 2015, the average cable bill increased nearly 8 times the rate of inflation. Compounding this is the increasing use of below-the-line fees, a strategy that the FCC's 18th annual video competition report described as raising monthly bills while typically leaving the advertised prices for video packages unchanged. Let's be honest. There are some providers that stand to benefit from a state of confusion, which is why the Commission's rules require them to notify customers in writing of specific information, including rate and service changes, charges for customer service changes, and basic tier availability. And in a world in which many consumers prefer to receive their monthly bill electronically, it is reasonable for us to consider whether our rules should be modernized to allow these currently required written notifications to be delivered in the same manner in which the bill is received by the customer. What I fear, however, is that if providers are allowed to switch the mode by which this information is delivered without the consumer's consent, it would give the provider another way to mask price increases and service changes. It is essential that consumers, not the companies providing the service, that the consumers are empowered with the choice of how to make these notifications are delivered, particularly when it comes to how much they will pay for monthly service. As originally circulated, the chairman's proposal would have allowed companies to solely make this decision on behalf of their customers. And I found that troubling. So I'm pleased that my colleagues agreed to scale this section back by seeking comment on whether the move to electronic notification should be done on an opt-in basis by the consumer. As we seek to modernize the delivery of cable communications, we must ensure that it is done in a way that puts consumers first. My thanks to my colleagues and the Media Bureau staff for your work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is time that our rules reflect that consumer desire for information has gone digital. There are many occasions when emailing a consumer is more appropriate and reflective of how the public communicates today than using the antiquated postal service. This item tentatively concludes that various requirements on cable operators to provide generic written communications to subscribers can be interpreted to include electronic delivery. When it comes to annual notices, rather than just having the option of delivering by mail or electronic means, I support allowing companies to post the requisite links on their website. For the consumer who wants this information, this is a logical place to find it. For the consumer that does not, why clutter their mailbox or inbox? This item rightfully considers what steps will be needed to permit electronic delivery of annual notices via other means reasonably calculated to reach the individual consumer. I hope as we move forward to final order, this approach will be permitted. Finally, I was pleased to see the Commission consider revising our rules on broadcast carriage election notification. I thank the chairman for accepting my edits to bolster this section and hope we can quickly move to final order on this topic as well. The retransmission consent process is often contentious enough without having to fight over whether documents were appropriately mailed. For these reasons, I support today's item. Next year, I trust we can move to final orders on the topics we've teed up and continue clearing out the regulatory underbrush. I'm also eager to begin looking at some of the more substantive ideas proposed in the record. Overall, our media modernization proceeding has shed light on a number of burdens that have outlived their usefulness, and I thank the chairman for his attention to the topic.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. This year, the FCC has made significant strides in modernizing outdated rules and reducing unnecessary paperwork burdens. This effort has been particularly welcome when it comes to the FCC's media regulations, which have languished without update for far too long. Take the FCC's Part 76 rules, which we tee up in today's notice of proposed rulemaking. These rules regulate cable operators' communications with their subscribers, but those rules are stuck in the snail mail era, requiring providers to send written notices to consumers, even when email is a more efficient and cost-effective means and one that the consumer prefers. Allowing cable operators to communicate with their subscribers electronically is long overdue, so I support today's notice. It contains common-sense proposals that will decrease paperwork burdens, especially for smaller cable providers, while ensuring that consumers receive information in the way they find most helpful. I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on this item. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
So on this one, I have a bias. I lose paper bills all the time. So the prospect of being able to make them available electronically is enticing. So this item has my full support, both personally and professionally. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Even in the digital age, many of us remain all too familiar with paper. One example, of course, is bill inserts, the extra sheets of paper that are stuck in the envelope with your bill for a particular service. Now, other than those who struggle to actually decipher them, I think most consumers simply ignore them. And these days, of course, we tend to prefer electronic communications over pulp. The FCC, too, shares that preference. We are working to reduce our own use of paper, and we're also aiming to modernize rules that unnecessarily require the private sector to stuff paper into your mailbox. And this notice is another step down that path. We're simply proposing to take the consumer-friendly step of allowing video companies, or MVPDs in the parlance, to send certain notices to subscribers electronically. Now, if it's finalized, this proposal could allow consumers to more readily access information about their services in a form that they find most convenient. And it would also get rid of a lot of environmental waste and reduce unnecessary regulatory costs, too. Now, there's a similar issue lurking about in one of our rules, and we seek public input in this notice on that, too. Today, broadcast television stations have to send MVPDs a notice telling them whether they are opting for must-carry of their content or retransmission consent. They have to send a separate election notice to each cable system or satellite carrier individually by certified mail. This doesn't seem to be as efficient or as necessary as it could be, so we're looking to how to streamline this notice requirement while still ensuring that MVPDs get the information that they need. I, along with my colleagues, would like to thank Steve Brockert, Michelle Carey, Katie Costello, Martha Heller, Maria Malarkey, and Mary Beth Murphy of the Media Bureau, and Susan Aaron and David Consul from the Office of General Counsel for the efforts on this notice. We'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The ayes have it with editorial privileges granted as requested. If only it were always so easy. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the final item on your agenda today will be presented by the Media Bureau. It is entitled Amendment of Section 73.355E of the Commission's Rules, National Television Multiple Ownership Rule, and once again, Bureau Chief Michelle Carey will give the introduction.
All right. Ms. Carey, whenever you're ready, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The next and last item the Media Bureau presents to you today is a notice of proposed rulemaking that undertakes a comprehensive review of the national audience reach cap and the UHF discount used by broadcasters to calculate compliance with the cap. This review marks the first time in well over a decade that the Commission has examined the National Television Multiple Ownership Rule in a holistic manner. Joining me at the table are Brendan Holland, Ty Bream, and Julie Saulnier of the Media Bureau. Julie will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, We present to you this notice of proposed rulemaking, which seeks to determine the future of the national television audience reach cap and UHF discount. As background, the national audience reach cap limits entities from owning or controlling television stations that, in the aggregate, reach more than 39% of the television households in the country. Earlier this year, the Commission reinstated a component of the rule, the UHF discount, which provides that, when calculating compliance with the national audience reach cap, stations broadcasting in the UHF spectrum are attributed with only 50% of the households in their designated market areas, as opposed to 100% of the households attributed to VHF stations. In reinstating the UHF discount, the Commission found that the 39% cap and discount are inextricably linked, and that eliminating the discount effectively tightened the cap without determining whether such tightening was in the public interest. At that time, the Commission committed to undertaking this comprehensive review of both the cap and discount. First, the notice takes a fresh look at the Commission's prior conclusion that it has the legal authority to modify or eliminate the national cap and UHF discount. Second, the notice asks whether the cap and discount should be modified or eliminated in light of increased video programming options for consumers, technological developments since the Commission adopted the current cap, or other factors. If the UHF discount is eliminated, the notice asks whether the cap should be simultaneously raised, and if so, by how much. Additionally, the notice seeks comment on the benefits and costs of lowering the cap. The notice next asks whether the national cap continues to serve the public interest, and if so, what public interest goals, such as localism, continue to justify a cap. The notice also asks whether retaining a cap harms the public interest in any way. The notice also seeks comment on how to calculate compliance with the national audience reach cap if one is retained. The original technical justification for the UHF discount, that analog UHF signals generally provided less coverage than VHF signals, disappeared with the transition to digital broadcasting. Therefore, the notice asks whether there are other reasons to retain the UHF discount or whether some other weighting method or discount should be used to calculate compliance with any remaining ownership limit. Finally, to the extent any change the Commission adopts causes broadcast station groups to become out of compliance with ownership limits, the notice asks whether such non-compliant station groups should be grandfathered and whether such station groups should subsequently be allowed to be transferred without divestitures. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saulnier. We will now proceed to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Television, like newspapers and like radio, works best when it speaks with many voices. And as these companies swallow one another up, there is a frightening possibility of it all speaking with one voice. I didn't do that justice. Television, like newspapers and like radio, works best when it speaks with many voices. And as these companies swallow one another up, there is the frightening possibility of it all speaking with one voice. Those sage words delivered by broadcast journalist Linda Ellerby in 2000 ring true today. In any other month, a proposal giving massive media companies the chance to have an even greater share of the local programming market would generate substantial attention and widespread public concerns. While admittedly this is not your typical month at the FCC, the reality is that such a proposal is before us for consideration, and it is a big deal with substantial implications for the future of localism, diversity, and competition. Broadcasters are intricately woven in the fabric of our local communities. They cover local officials and, when at their best, hold them accountable, while cable news or online platforms are more likely to paint broad strokes, local broadcasters distinguish themselves through their ability to fill in the fine lines. Local broadcasters often go through great lengths to stay on the air during a natural or man-made crisis, providing on-the-ground coverage when news breaks, including the delivery of emergency information that no doubt has saved countless lives. In 2004, Congress passed and President George W. Bush signed into law a provision that no single broadcaster, through its combination of local stations owned, collectively should be able to reach more than 39% of the U.S. television households. While I cannot say for certain that the sentiments expressed by the late William Safire reflected the legislative mood of the day, it is striking that 14 years ago he was motivated to write, through a New York Times op-ed, "The effect of the media's march to amalgamation of America's freedom of voice is too worrisome to be left to 3 unelected commissioners." Soon after, Congress, through Section 629(1), subsection 1 of the Appropriations Act of 2004, specifically exempted the 39% cap on national audience reach from review. This was evidently the prevailing view because in 2004, NAB President Edward Fitz said, "We're pleased the national television ownership cap issue appears to be resolved by the passage of this legislation." Press accounts at the time, including a January 2004 story in Broadcasting and Cable, affirmed that one of the few features of the law was that, quote, "Only Congress, not the FCC, can change the 39% limit." Facing a challenge from broadcasters who sought to maintain a 45% national ownership cap, the Third Circuit issued its opinion in June of 2004. In the court's decision, it wrote, "Because the Commission is under a statutory directive to modify the national television ownership cap to 39%, challenges to the Commission's decision to raise the cap to 45% are moot. This decision should have once and for all put to rest any question that the FCC could independently increase the cap. But no. The current administration, in its quest to greenlight even greater media consolidation, has found a way to rewrite history and ignore the Third Circuit decision. Earlier this year, over my vociferous objection, the FCC majority reinstated the UHF discount, giving the blessing for a single company to reach over 70% of the U.S. households while claiming to be compliant with the 39% national ownership cap. In 2004, when Congress enacted the cap, the DTV transition was still 5 years away. But thanks to the transition to digital television, UHF stations are no longer inferior to VHF stations. This can be nothing else but that broadcasters, with the blessing of the FCC majority, are using this arbitrary loophole to expand their reach far beyond what Congress ever envisioned. How did we get to this point? Harken back to June of 2003, when the FCC voted along party lines to increase the national ownership cap from 35 to 45%. This decision was not without significant controversy. Even the National Rifle Association at the time came out in opposition, arguing that the loosening of the FCC's media ownership rules should be rejected, and I quote, "for the sake of our democracy." Leading into the fall of that same year, Congress continued to debate the issue, and there were bipartisan House and Senate resolutions introduced that disapproved of the FCC's deregulation of the media ownership rules. There were also multiple congressional hearings that year. Senator Trent Lott, in describing his opposition to raising the cap, said, and I quote, that the nation is in danger of losing the localism and diversity of viewpoints that are offered under the current ownership cap structure if the current cap is raised, end quote. Strong words from the former Senate leader, and he was not alone. A deeply fought battle ultimately resulted in a compromise between congressional leadership and the White House. That November, an agreement was reached that a 39% national ownership cap was established that will be put into law just 2 months later. While many remained unhappy, the purpose was to put this debate to rest, or so they thought. Fast forward to last month, when Democratic leader Pelosi, along with Representatives Pallone and Doyle, wrote in a letter to the commission that by explicitly excluding review of the cap from the congressionally mandated quadrennial review of broadcast ownership rules, we made clear that the FCC is not permitted to change or evade the national ownership cap. I agree. Localism, diversity, and competition are bedrock principles of our national media policy and indeed our democracy. Giving a single broadcaster the means to buy up enough local stations to exceed the 39% cap is inconsistent with the statute and should be rejected. FCC Chairman Michael Powell once said that the FCC is constitutionally bound to comply, willingly or not, with Congress's direction as expressed by the text of the statute. Maybe today will be the day the majority will heed those words and join me in opposing today's proposal, because if nothing else is clear when it comes to this item, it is that we, the FCC, has absolutely no authority to act. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support today's item, which initiates a defined process to review the Commission's National Television Multiple Ownership Rule, commonly referred to as the National Audience Reach Cap. This is a topic I've spent too much time over the years working on, so I'd like to clear up many of the misconceptions surrounding it. First, I want to be absolutely clear on my position on the matter. As I've stated previously, I do not believe the Commission has the authority to modify the National Audience Reach Cap, which also extends to eliminating the UHF discount. Well, the discount may no longer be technologically justified. It is up to Congress to make that determination, not the Commission. This was the clear intent of Congress when it partially rolled back the FCC's proposed cap increase of 45% in 2004. While many lawyers have their own interpretations of the 2004 Consolidated Appropriation Acts, I want to provide a little history. After extensive debate and too many meetings to count, Congress enacted the relevant portions of the CAA. The language in the law cannot be any clearer. It statutorily sets the national ownership limit and correspondingly removes it from the quadrennial review under Section 202H of the Telecommunications Act. Some, including the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, have argued that Congress only meant to remove consideration of the national audience reach cap from the biennial review, not to prohibit it from being changed as part of any other effort. But such a reading is preposterous, as it would effectively create one of the biggest backdoors in the history of legislating. At the same time, the view ignores the deal that was struck in those bitterly heated member meetings and huddles. In exchange for the hard cap, those who supported former Chairman Powell's work obtained an ownership level that prevented any station group from being forced to sell off any stations, and a commitment that the UHF discount would still apply going forward. I realize that some people don't have a high opinion of congressional experience, but I will forever have etched in my mind former Ted Stevens screaming that if some station group wanted to go above 39%, they could come to Congress and try to get the cap amended. That was a different day and a different Congress, and maybe it relied on Senator Stevens serving forever. But it should count for something. It certainly does to me, even if I intellectually agree that both the cap and discount are archaic and in need of reform. Despite my firsthand experiences, there is broad disagreement among interested parties over the Commission's authority in this space. During the prior Commission's proceeding to eliminate the UHF discount, NAB and Free Press argued that the Commission had the authority to both eliminate the UHF discount and modify the national audience reach cap. The Commission ultimately agreed with the support of a couple of my colleagues here today. On the other hand, Fox, Sinclair, ION, and Trinity Broadcast Network all challenged the Commission's authority. I appreciate the irony that my views are aligned with those previously filed by Sinclair, who outside critics mistakenly believe I'm currently in cahoots with, that the Commission was devoid of authority to take action, as fate would have it, supposedly would help Sinclair today. Specifically, Sinclair stated in 2013, the FCC does not have authority to modify any aspect of the national television ownership cap, including the UHF discount. In establishing the 39% limit for the ownership cap in 2004, Congress set a precise limit and then took the extra step of removing this limit and any rule relating it from the FCC's periodic review of its ownership rules. No action by Congress has changed these facts, and accordingly, the FCC should terminate this proceeding and halt its efforts to eliminate the UHF discount. In a perhaps more curious twist, it appears that my same colleagues that previously supported changes in 2016 also now question the Commission's authority. For these reasons, I believe it's time for the courts to opine on this matter. We need certainty in a way that only the courts or Congress can provide as to where the Commission authority begins and ends. Since it doesn't appear congressional action is forthcoming, I look forward to reviewing the record that will result from this proceeding. If the Commission believes after such a review that it has the authority to modify the cap, I will happily support that item. That is not to suggest my position has changed, but only that I believe in getting to finality and willing to cast a vote that will allow the Commission to take the needed steps to get this to court review. Second, outside the authority question, I think it's important to put this order in context. The truth is, the last fight over the national audience reach cap generally occurred not because of its potential impact on consumers, but rather to safeguard an important balance between the big four broadcast networks and their local affiliates. Prior to the congressional action in 2004, the Commission found that these rules did not promote competition or diversity. For these reasons, the Commission increased the current cap from 35% to 45% to allow broadcast networks to achieve greater economies of scale without surpassing the audience reach of their collective affiliates. Congress later scaled back this to 39% with the same focus in mind, maintaining the appropriate balance between networks and their affiliates. It's also worth noting that even if the national audience reach cap is increased or eliminated, the practical effect will likely be limited, assuming the Commission complies with congressional direction on the UHF discount. Today, the majority of the top 10 television stations do not even come close to the cap. For instance, CBS Corporation, which ranks 5th, only has a national audience reach of 25.5%. Hearst Corporation, at 10th, has an audience reach of 13.3%. All this is to say, well, I support asking questions and ultimately resolving this issue of the Commission's authority on the matter. Whether we maintain or alter the cap is likely to have little real-world impact in the near future. I thank the Chairman for teeing up this item and asking the broad range of questions. I will approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Since the 1940s, the FCC has had rules on the books that limit the number of television stations any single entity can own. Over the decades, as the media landscape has evolved, the Commission has revisited these rules to account for new competitors and advances in technology. Those changes have only accelerated in recent years with the advent of online offerings. Broadcasters now compete for eyeballs with YouTube stars, social media platforms, and streaming services like Hulu and Netflix, not to mention traditional cable and satellite offerings. In light of these changes, I'm glad that we're launching this proceeding, which will examine whether we can and should modify our rules that limit broadcasters, but not others, in the video marketplace from reaching more than 39% of television households in the country. Answering these questions will help ensure that our media ownership rules are neither outdated nor counterproductive. And at the same time, I'm surprised that the issue of the Commission's legal authority in this area has generated so much controversy. After all, the FCC determined in 2016 that, quote, the Commission has the authority to modify the national audience reach cap. Continuing, The Commission found that, quote, no statute bars the Commission from revisiting the cap. Congress did not, according to the FCC, quote, impose a statutory national audience reach cap or prohibit the Commission from evaluating the elements of this rule. All three Democrats on the Commission, including two of my colleagues here today, voted for that order. No one in the majority concurred, wrote a separate statement, or otherwise qualified their support for the FCC's 2016 determinations. And while several seats up here have changed since then, the law has not. So the suggestion by some that the FCC now lacks authority to do exactly what my colleagues said the Commission could do in 2016 is curious, to say the least. Today's notice asks simply whether my colleagues got it right in 2016 when they determined that the FCC has authority to modify the cap. So far, I've not seen anything that convinces me they got it wrong. But I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops in this proceeding. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For decades, the FCC has built its media policies around the ideas that localism, diversity, and competition matter. These values have their origin in the Communications Act. They may not be trendy, but they have stood the test of time. They continue to support journalism and jobs. They play a critical role in helping advance the mix of facts we all need to make decisions about our lives, our communities, and our country. Today, the FCC seeks to dismantle these values. At a time when real facts get casually derided as fake news, algorithms are ascendant, and what is viral is often not verifiable. This is neither prudent nor wise. It is also unlawful. At the direction of Congress in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2004, the FCC is statutorily prohibited from allowing a single company from acquiring stations that reach more than 39% of the national television audience. The FCC lacks authority to change this law. Doing so is the exclusive province of Congress. But somehow, some way, we have this rulemaking anyway. And somehow we are still talking about the UHF discount, a concept that should have been retired nearly a decade ago with the introduction of digital television, which rendered it technically outdated and scientifically obsolete. Moreover, this concept is nowhere mentioned in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2004. Still, here we are. And this effort, on the heels of this agency's repeal of the main studio rule, elimination of the 8 voices test, and giving the green light for waivers of common ownership of the top 4 stations in a market, is ultimately destructive. We are destroying our most basic values and tearing apart the rules that have helped keep our media markets local, diverse, and competitive. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. The national television ownership cap and the UHF discount are inextricably linked. Any review of one must include a review of the other. What is the FCC's authority to adjust this cap? And assuming we have such authority, how should we adjust it? Should we eliminate the UHF discount? Those are the key questions we are asking in this notice. There are no tentative conclusions whatsoever. We're just asking. It is amusing then to hear such vociferous objections from this bench, including in the last few minutes, quote, we have absolutely no authority to act, and, I quote, the FCC lacks authority to change this law. Such objections are simply asking the question whether we have authority, given that the same commissioners previously answered it in the affirmative. In 2013, the FCC adopted the UHF discount notice of proposed rulemaking, which stated, and I quote, we believe the Commission retains the authority to modify both the national audience reach restriction and the UHF discount, provided such action is undertaken in a rulemaking proceeding separate from the Commission's quadrennial review of the broadcast ownership rules. Today's minority expressed nary a doubt about that belief back then. And just last year, in 2016, the FCC converted that belief into bedrock. it definitively, and I quote, concluded that it has the authority to modify the national audience reach cap, including the authority to revise or eliminate the UHF discount. And it went even further, stating the Communications Act does, and I quote, not impose a statutory national audience reach cap or prohibit the Commission from evaluating the elements of this rule. Yet again, the current minority voted wholeheartedly for that proposition. Now, look, I understand the literary appeal of Oscar Wilde's dictum that consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative. But our work typically demands a modicum of consistency, boring though it may be. It is also amusing that those who have repeatedly voiced their strong opposition to the UHF discount in recent months are now voting against seeking comment on getting rid of it. Make no mistake, a vote against this notice is effectively a vote in favor of keeping the UHF discount in place. Now, getting back to the substance of this notice, we need to take a holistic look at the national cap rule, including the UHF discount. The marketplace has changed considerably due to the explosion of video programming options and various technological advances that have occurred since the cap was last considered in 2004. So we need to examine whether our rules should change accordingly. That is an important discussion that will be informed by the facts and the record, not anything else. I'd like to thank the dedicated staff that worked on this notice, Ty Breen, Michelle Carey, Brenton Holland, Mary Beth Murphy, and Julie Saulnier from the Media Bureau, and David Consul, Bill Richardson, and Royce Sherlock from the Office of General Counsel. We'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Nay.
Commissioner Riley.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks, folks, for the hard work. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time?
Yes, quickly. Is it under 4 hours? 4 hours and 50 minutes?
I think we've got 30, 40 minutes before we hit that.
All right.
Take your time.
Yes, yeah. I figured, based on last month, I can say this one word a minute. So I'm delighted to announce that April Jones has joined my office as a policy analyst and special assistant. If she's still in the room, if you would stand. She has a diverse background and will be and is already a tremendous asset in our continual work to put consumers first and uphold our principles. She came to us from the office of Hausfeld?
Oh, Hausfeld?
Feld? Yeah, Feld. Oh, yeah. Hausfeld. There's no I there. A global antitrust firm. She previously worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she primarily worked on e-commerce and telecommunications. Those were in her portfolio. She received her J.D. from the George Washington University School of Law, where she completed an international human rights law program at the University of Oxford, and she received her undergraduate degree from the University of Southern California. Welcome.
Welcome aboard, April. Anybody else?
Sure, quick one. I'd like to introduce Evan Schwartzstraber, new addition to our office. He's joining my office as an advisor on media regulation. You have to stand up. That's the tradition around here, part of the grilling. He started with us 2 weeks ago, so he's found the pace around the commission to be a little slow and the public's interest in our work a bit underwhelming. I've told him just wait until we take up poll attachments again. That's when things get really interesting around here, and they bring in C-SPAN 8, the Ocho, to help cover it. But in all seriousness, I'm delighted Evan joined the office. He has a keen instinct for communications policy, having worked most recently at Tech Freedom on a broad range of telecom issues, from broadcasting to broadband deployment. I look forward to relying on his expertise as we move forward and recede again into the regulatory backwaters. Now, with this new addition, that means my office no longer gets the chance to benefit from the good work of Kevin Holmes, who had been serving as an acting legal advisor in my office since August. Kevin's been an invaluable member of my team, and I'm grateful for his contributions over the past few months, including on many wireless infrastructure items that we've taken up. And I'm glad that the Commission will continue to benefit from Kevin's public service. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right. I want to welcome Jessica Martinez to my staff, to the FCC, and to this rollicking first meeting that she's had. She comes to my office from the U.S. House Energy Commerce Committee's Democratic staff, where she served as Outreach and Member Services Coordinator. She's also served as the communications director for the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association. And before her time on Capitol Hill, she served as an associate with a DC strategic firm where she focused on healthcare policy. And her prior experience also includes time as a fellow with the Progressive Caucus, an internship with the Democratic Steering and Outreach Committee, and as the Latino Outreach Coordinator for the Utah State Democratic Party. She is the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and she put herself through the University of Utah as a waitress and a forklift driver. So we've got double the Jessica in the office. Got someone who worked as a forklift driver. Last month we introduced you to Umair, who worked as a firefighter. And the month before it was Kate, who is shortly publishing a book entitled Badass Women. Whoa. So the net of that is you mess with us at your peril. Welcome, Jessica.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Can I just,
go ahead.
Can I just say, double the Jessica? That is that's the thought.
Uh-oh.
But I had the chance to meet Commissioner Rosenworcel's staff, Commissioner Clyburn's staff, and happen to know Evan from working in the past. So I'm looking forward to working with those. Even if we don't always agree on substance, it was a pleasure, and my staff looks forward to working with them all. Thank you.
So I just had a few announcements. First, Pat Carney. I don't know if Pat is here. Is he not? Pat is well known to everybody here at the Commission. If you've ever had an ethical issue, a form to fill out, or whatever, Pat is the key guy. He's the head of the ethics team in the Office of General Counsel. He joined FCC's ethics team in 1995 after spending about 2 decades in the Navy. He served as an officer in the JAG Corps, ultimately attaining the rank of captain. And he served the Commission as Assistant General Counsel for Ethics since 2002. And in that capacity, he earned the FCC's Silver Medal for Meritorious Service, the FCC's Catherine Forster Public Service Award, and the FCBA's Outstanding Government Service Award. Pat's stewardship of the ethics program has been incredible. I mean, he's one of those guys where you don't appreciate the job that he does because he does it consistently so well, but if he didn't do it, you certainly would notice it. More importantly, though, he is just a gem of a human being. I've had the chance to work with him both when I was a staffer in the Office of General Counsel and now in the current role, and he's always got an even temperament, a smile on his face, and just a genuinely good heart. So, Pat, wherever you are, Godspeed. Thank you for your service to the Commission. We are so grateful to call you a colleague and a friend. Next, Jane Jackson. I don't know if Jane is here either. They're probably both hard at work. So Jane also is departing the Commission. She began her career here in 1976 in the FCC's first cable television bureau. After stints as an attorney at PBS and as a law professor, she returned to the FCC in 1984 to serve in the Common Carrier Bureau's Computer to Implementation Task Force. Man, there's a throwback for you. The next year, she joined CCB's Accounting and Audit Division, where she was promoted to chief of the legal branch in 1991. In 1993-94, she practiced in the private sector, and then yet again, Godfather style, we pulled her back into the CCB's Policy Division. She was subsequently promoted to deputy chief and then chief of the Pricing Division in the Wireline Bureau. And from 2001 to 2005, she served as associate bureau chief at WCB. And from 2015 until 2014 as the associate bureau chief in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, which is where I had the chance to first meet her starting in 2007. Since 2014, the Office of General Counsel has had the incredible good fortune of having her serve as a special counsel in the Administrative Law Division, where her just unparalleled editing and problem-solving skills have been tremendous assets to the Commission. Thank you, Jane, wherever you are, for your work as well. Somber farewell also. We are saddened to learn of the sudden passing of Ed Lee, the mayor of San Francisco and a member of the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee. Mr. Lee was born in 1952 in the Seattle neighborhood of Beacon Hill. He was one of 6 children of Chinese immigrants who came to the United States in the 1930s. He was the 43rd mayor of San Francisco and the first ever Asian American elected to that position. He was a member of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, where, among other things, he served as the chair of the Technology and Innovation Task Force. And as I point out, he's a member of that Intergovernmental Advisory Committee in June of 2014. He was appointed to that position and was currently serving a second appointment after his term expired in 2016. Mayor Lee passed away suddenly this past Tuesday, December 12th, at the age of 65. I think his legacy serves as an inspiration to all Americans, and we certainly wish his wife, Anita, and his entire family our sincerest condolences. Last but not least, I just want to take a brief minute to express my support and prayers to those affected by the wildfires currently raging in Southern California. To get a sense of the devastation there, reports indicate that as of yesterday, more than 263,000 acres, that's an area larger than New York City and Boston combined, have been burned, and hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to evacuate. And in addition to my concerns for the safety of those who are caught in harm's way, I also want to extend my gratitude to the over 8,500 firefighters and strike teams and other first responders who are on the front lines helping to keep people safe in the Southland. It's clearly a time to pull together, and I'm heartened to learn that over 700 firefighters from 10 states have provided and continue to provide mutual aid assistance to the state of California. For our part, the FCC stands ready and willing to assist our federal and state and local emergency first responders on the ground and to ensure that emergency 911 call centers remain accessible to all. I'm especially pleased to hear some reports in the press that wireless emergency alerts have been used to successfully warn affected communities, including the use of clickable URLs in text messages. These URLs, these websites, have given people direct access to additional public safety information. In addition to reporting on wireless and wireline communications outage information with FEMA, we've also been monitoring broadcast radio and television stations in these affected areas. As we've seen, as I've personally seen in other emergency scenarios, including, of course, during Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria earlier this year, radio and TV broadcasters often serve as critical first sources of reliable information for the public and for the victims of disasters. According to NAB and Nielsen, over 1 million more residents in the LA area tuned in to local newscasts on broadcast stations last week than in the previous week as wildfires spread across Southern California. And I dare say I think I speak for many of my colleagues when I say that I'm grateful for the local broadcasters working around the clock to provide Californians with a trusted, up-to-date source of news and emergency information during this time of crisis. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements,
Thank you. It's so interesting and appropriate that we end the meeting the way we began, underscoring our mission, our goal in terms of public safety. So my condolences, as you mentioned, to the family of Mayor Lee. We were just stunned. I can't imagine the pain that his family and the city is experiencing. And even though I was not able to thank him this round for his service to this agency, I thank him. Pat Carney and Jane Jackson, just when he mentioned that, and I knew it was coming, I just started shaking inside. I can't imagine my FCC experience without those two people. Not that I need watching or monitoring. I don't want to put that out there. But the fact that I knew that I had a backstop just gave me great comfort. Look, I hope they don't leave. I hope they change their mind. That Godfather thing you mentioned, I hope somehow we are able to, that influence. But short of that, I just want to thank them for their service. And no matter how silly the question or how much I might have tried them into talking to them into one or two things, they always kept me compliant, and I want to say thank you. And again, what California is going through is just surreal. But as you mentioned, you want to thank those first responders, thank our staff, out on the West Coast for giving the support they need, and just as though you saw a lot of differences and differing opinions, you witnessed today. The one thing that unifies us is our commitment to serve, particularly when it comes to the public safety needs of this nation. You will not hear anyone have a crossword with each other when it comes to that. So I want to thank you for ending by underscoring our mission.
Very, very well said, Commissioner Clyburn. I completely agree. And with that, I'll turn to Madam Secretary to announce the date of the next Commission open agenda meeting.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Tuesday, January 30th, 2018.
And with that, the Commission meeting is adjourned.